Foucault's Biopolitics, how governments came to manage bodies, not just laws. You wake up to an email from your health provider. Your steps have been counted, your heart rate monitored, your location mapped. A gentle message reminds you to hydrate, to sleep better, to make wise choices. It feels helpful, it feels harmless. But somewhere inside, a strange awareness flickers. You are being governed. Not through force, not through fear, but through care. This is the quiet revolution Michel Foucault called biopolitics. Power, he said, has changed. It no longer rules only with chains and prisons. It no longer operates just by law or decree. Modern power slips inside your body. It regulates your breath, your hunger, your desire, your risk. It tracks populations, categorizes illness, manages birth rates, defines what is normal. Biopolitics is the art of governing not just people, but life itself. In earlier times, power was sovereign. A king could kill. Authority meant the right to take life. But in the modern era, power becomes productive. It doesn't just take life, it makes life. It creates institutions that nurture, train, and shape you. Schools, hospitals, prisons, census forms. You are not merely ruled. You are managed, optimized, monitored. And most of the time, you cooperate. You schedule your checkups. You count your calories. You internalize the gaze. Foucault called this governmentality, a form of power so deep, so soft, that it feels like freedom. But it is not neutral, because in choosing what lives to support, biopolitics also decides what lives are disposable. It defines the deviant, the dangerous, the diseased. It creates hierarchies of health, race, gender, productivity. Who gets resources? Who gets care? Who gets locked away? Foucault never gave easy answers. He didn't tell us how to resist, but he taught us how to see, how to recognize the subtle disciplines that train us from birth. He showed us that power is not just in the courthouse or the battlefield, it is in the hospital form, the school bell, the wellness app. Biopolitics teaches us that modern control does not always punish. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it heals. And that's what makes it so powerful. But if Foucault taught us to watch how power shapes life from within, what happens when power is drawn in sharper lines between ally and enemy, order and threat, belonging and exclusion? Because in the next reflection, we step into a colder vision, one where politics begins not with people, but with enemies. Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction. The dark origin of us versus them politics. You walk into a crowded room. Some faces feel familiar, others do not. You scan for signals, a nod, a flag, a phrase that marks who is with you and who is not. It feels instinctive, almost natural. But this is more than tribal reflex. This is political. Carl Schmitt, the controversial German jurist of the 20th century, believed that all true politics begins with a single, brutal line: who is a friend and who is an enemy. Not in the personal sense, not who you dislike or who insults you, but in the existential sense: who threatens the order you believe in, who affirms it. For Schmitt, politics was not primarily about compromise, debate, or lawmaking. It was about distinction. It was about the power to decide. When the state functions normally, it masks this division behind rules, institutions, and rituals. But in moments of crisis, war, revolution, collapse, the mask slips. Power reveals itself not as neutral arbitration, but as the authority to decide over life and death. The sovereign, Schmitt famously wrote, is he who decides on the exception. In other words, true power is not defined by who follows the law, but by who has the authority to suspend it. In liberal democracies, this idea is deeply uncomfortable. We prefer to imagine politics as procedural, legal, and bound by norms. But Schmitt argued this was an illusion. When the stakes rise and identity hardens, politics returns to its essence, the division between us and them. This doesn't mean violence is inevitable, but it means the potential for violence is always present. Because the enemy, in Schmitt's view, is not merely someone to disagree with. The enemy is someone whose very existence challenges the legitimacy of your world. Schmitt's vision is stark, even chilling. It explains why politics becomes tribal, why states mobilize fear, and why patriotism can easily curdle into purges. It's why dissenters are often framed not as wrong but as threats. Schmitt has been used and misused by radicals, autocrats, and critics of liberalism, but his insight endures. Every political identity carries a shadow. And the moment of truth is not when rules are followed, it's when rules are broken in order to preserve what is seen as essential. If Schmitt showed how political systems draw sharp lines between friend and enemy, what happens when systems become so efficient, so normal, that evil no longer wears a monster's face, but a human one? Because in the next reflection, we will explore Hannah Arendt's haunting idea of the banality of evil. Arendt's banality of evil. How ordinary obedience breeds atrocity. A man stands trial for crimes so vast they defy comprehension. He was not a warlord, not a bloodstained dictator. He was a bureaucrat, a man in a suit with polished shoes and careful manners. He spoke in vague terms, cited procedures, and claimed he was simply doing his job. This was Adolf Eichmann, a central organizer of the Holocaust, and it was Hannah Arendt, reporting from his trial in Jerusalem, who offered a phrase that would reshape how we think about evil itself, the banality of evil. Arendt did not mean that evil is trivial. She meant that it can be terrifyingly ordinary, that evil doesn't always come with horns or hatred. Sometimes it comes with spreadsheets, with routine, with obedience. Eichmann was not, in Arendt's view, a monster. He was a joiner, a man who conformed, who sought approval, who stopped thinking when thinking was most needed. He followed orders, performed his function, and spoke in clichés. And that, Arendt argued, was the most chilling part. The worst crimes can be committed not by the fanatical, but by the thoughtless. Arendt's insight shattered the comforting belief that evil always looks like villainy. It showed that under certain systems, ordinary people can become agents of extraordinary harm, not because they are consumed by hatred, but because they are unwilling to reflect. What she called the banality was the failure to think, the collapse of judgment in favor of habit, loyalty, and convenience. Evil became banal when it no longer shocked, no longer required deep feeling, no longer seemed like a choice at all. It is easy to imagine ourselves as immune, to believe we would resist. But Arendt invites a deeper discomfort, what happens when systems are built to reward obedience and punish doubt, when thinking for yourself becomes a threat. She does not excuse. She does not moralize. She warns. The banality of evil is a mirror, not for monsters, but for citizens. It reminds us that every society depends not just on laws or leaders, but on the moral courage of individuals to ask, to judge, and sometimes to disobey. And in this quiet failure of reflection, we find the seed of something vast and terrible. But if Arendt warned of how evil can thrive in ordinary compliance, what happens when political strategy demands something else entirely: cunning, calculation, and the ruthless preservation of power? Because in the next reflection, we enter the hard world of Niccolò Machiavelli and his cold, enduring vision of realpolitik. Machiavelli's realpolitik, the art of staying in power no matter the cost. You stand at the gates of a Renaissance city-state, the sun low behind towers of stone. Inside, political rivals maneuver in the shadows. Alliances shift. Trust is a currency quickly spent. And at the center of it all sits the figure who dared to strip politics of illusion, Niccolò Machiavelli. In his most famous work, The Prince, Machiavelli didn't write about how politics ought to be. He wrote about how it actually works. He observed the raw struggle for power and dared to ask what others would not. How should a ruler act if their goal is not goodness but survival? He concluded that virtue in politics is not about moral purity, it's about effectiveness, success, the ability to preserve order, wield power, and keep enemies at bay. If a ruler must choose between being loved and being feared, he wrote, then fear is safer. If deception is necessary, use it. If cruelty secures peace, do not hesitate. Machiavelli's advice was not a blueprint for tyranny. It was a manual for political realism. A ruler, he believed, must be flexible, even ruthless, not because they are evil, but because the world is. Fortune, he said, is like a river, wild and unpredictable. You cannot control its rise, but you can build walls to guide its force. A wise leader, then, is like an engineer of human affairs, bold, calculating, willing to get their hands dirty. For centuries, Machiavelli has been misunderstood. His name became synonymous with manipulation and treachery. But his real crime was honesty. He refused to cloak power in moral pretenses. He saw that politics is often a contest not between good and evil, but between the strong and the naive. He broke with the classical ideal that rulers must be virtuous in the moral sense. He argued instead for virtu, a quality of boldness, cunning, and adaptability, a capacity to act decisively, even violently, when the moment demands it. In doing so, Machiavelli pulled back the curtain on political theater. He showed that behind noble speeches and solemn rituals, the engine of statecraft often runs on ambition, fear, and calculated risk. Whether you agree with him or not, his vision endures because it confronts us with a hard truth. Those who govern must not only know what is right, they must know how to survive. But if Machiavelli revealed the mechanics of holding power, what happens when power is not held by rulers but by ideas, quietly shaping culture, consent, and common sense? Because in the next reflection, we explore Antonio Gramsci's insight into cultural hegemony and the slow, invisible war for the human mind. Gramsci's cultural hegemony: why revolutions fail before they begin. You walk through a city filled with billboards, school books, news broadcasts, and lullabies. None of them seem political. They speak of family, safety, progress. They soothe, they repeat. And without realizing it, you start to believe that this is just the way things are. Antonio Gramsci called this cultural hegemony, a form of power not enforced with weapons but with stories, values, and norms. Gramsci, writing from a fascist prison cell in the early 20th century, saw that revolutions fail not just because of police or armies, but because of consent. People internalize the worldview of those in power. They live within the dominant narrative, even when it works against them. For Gramsci, the ruling class does not maintain power by force alone. It shapes what counts as common sense. It builds a cultural world in which its values feel natural, inevitable, even moral. Education, religion, media, entertainment. These are not neutral fields. They are battlegrounds, places where ideologies are formed, normalized, and passed along without resistance. In this view, power is not just about controlling people's bodies, it's about shaping their minds. When a worker believes that their poverty is a failure of personal effort rather than a structural condition, hegemony is working. When a citizen sees inequality and calls it freedom, hegemony is working. When the powerless defend the powerful, convinced that change is dangerous or impossible, hegemony has already won. Gramsci argued that counter-hegemony is the true work of revolution. Not just protest, not just policy, but building alternative ways of seeing the world. Narratives that challenge the dominant ones. Institutions that teach different values. Artists, writers, teachers, organizers, all involved in the long, patient struggle to shift the culture from within. Power in this light is not seized in a moment. It is built, brick by brick, in classrooms and kitchens and community centers. Gramsci gives us a new lens for understanding why some political orders endure, even when they fail to serve the many. And why real change must begin not only in law or economy, but in imagination. But if culture is the scaffolding of power, what happens when governments decide that legality is a luxury and survival means rewriting the rules in real time? Agamben's theory of sovereign exception reveals the spaces where law disappears and something far more dangerous takes its place. Agamben's state of exception. When emergency becomes permanent rule, a border is drawn, a camp is built, a curfew is announced, and suddenly, what was once protected by law is now exposed to something else entirely, a form of power that suspends rules instead of enforcing them. This is the space Giorgio Agamben calls the state of exception, a place where law is no longer applied, yet still remains. Agamben, drawing from the writings of Carl Schmitt, argued that modern political power often functions by creating zones of ambiguity. States declare emergencies, suspend normal rights, and operate in a legal vacuum that paradoxically becomes permanent. The exception becomes the rule. In these moments, governments do not abandon law, they invoke it. They claim the authority to suspend it in order to protect it. They say, to preserve the Constitution, we must override it. To defend life, we must limit freedom. Agamben saw this logic spreading not just in totalitarian regimes, but in democracies. Temporary measures linger. Emergency powers stretch across decades. Camps appear on the edge of legality, places where people are held not as citizens but as bodies without rights. The airport detention center, the refugee camp, the quarantine zone. These are not breakdowns of law, they are the hidden machinery of modern governance. Agamben believed that the true danger of the state of exception is its invisibility, because it claims to be temporary, because it claims to be necessary, because it presents itself as the defense of order, not its undoing. But once the exception is normalized, everything changes. Citizens are turned into suspects. Bodies become subjects of management. Rights are reframed as privileges that can be revoked. The state of exception is not always announced with fanfare. It often arrives quietly, under the cover of security, efficiency, or care. Agamben forces us to ask where sovereignty really resides, not just in constitutions or elections, but in the ability to decide when law no longer applies. He asks us to notice the boundaries, those legal gray zones where power does not end, but mutates. And he warns that in the name of protection, we may one day find ourselves in a world where legality is suspended, but control remains absolute. Yet if Agamben reveals how politics reshapes life through zones of exclusion, what happens when the very ideologies we live under go unnoticed, so deeply embedded in our thinking that we no longer see them at all? Žižek's ideology critique. Why we don't see what shapes our politics. You walk into a store. Soft music plays. A friendly slogan greets you above the entrance, because you deserve it. You don't question it. Why would you? It's just branding. Just a slogan. Just background noise. But for Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, these background noises are not neutral. They are ideology in action, subtle, self-justifying myths that structure how we live, think, and desire. Ideology, in Žižek's view, is not just found in propaganda or political slogans. It's embedded in everyday life, in jokes, in architecture, in cinema, in casual phrases like, "it is what it is." He builds on Marx and Lacan to argue that ideology isn't a mask over reality. It is reality, or at least the way we experience it. The most effective ideologies aren't the ones we recognize. They're the ones we don't notice. Žižek's famous phrase captures it well. They do not know it, but they are doing it. We may believe we are free, critical, ironic even, but we continue to participate in systems we think we see through. That's the trap. Not false belief, but enacted belief. Consider capitalism. Many of us are aware of its flaws. We joke about it, we critique it, and yet we participate in it daily, often without question. This is ideology at its most powerful, not when it fools us, but when it becomes the air we breathe. Žižek also critiques the way ideology absorbs rebellion. A political t-shirt sold at a luxury price, a revolutionary slogan printed on a coffee mug. Protest becomes product. In this process, dissent is diffused. We believe we are resisting, but the system absorbs our resistance and sells it back to us. And then there's fantasy, what Žižek calls the unconscious frame that gives structure to ideology. We act not just from what we believe, but from what we fantasize about. Stability, order, a return to greatness, a better tomorrow. These fantasies shape political action more than facts ever could. For Žižek, the goal is not to escape ideology. There is no pure outside. The goal is to become aware of its mechanisms, to recognize the invisible scripts we follow, to ask, constantly, why does this feel natural? Who benefits when I stop asking questions? And perhaps most dangerously, what am I helping sustain even as I claim to resist it? Fraser's Redistribution and Recognition. The political cost of ignoring dignity. A factory closes in a small town. Jobs vanish. Families struggle. At the same time, a social movement rises, demanding dignity, respect, and visibility for a marginalized group. These two stories seem different, but for political philosopher Nancy Fraser, they are deeply connected. Fraser argues that justice has two faces, economic redistribution and cultural recognition. And in modern politics, we often fail because we try to address one while ignoring the other. Redistribution is about resources, wages, healthcare, housing, opportunity. Recognition is about respect, freedom from stigma, misrepresentation, and exclusion. Fraser contends that both are necessary for real justice and that separating them weakens both struggles. She critiques a world in which some progressives focus solely on identity, celebrating visibility without addressing economic precarity. And equally, she warns that focusing only on class without acknowledging racial, gendered, or cultural injustice reproduces other hierarchies. In Fraser's model, injustice is often a double bind. A working-class immigrant woman might face poverty and cultural disrespect. A trans person might gain visibility while still being locked out of housing or employment. A racial minority might receive symbolic inclusion in media while being excluded from material resources. Justice, then, is not a single battle. It is a terrain of overlapping struggles. Fraser calls for participatory parity, a condition where all people can interact as equals in social life, both economically and culturally. That means addressing institutional structures that produce inequality and also the cultural norms that enforce it. She is also critical of what she calls progressive neoliberalism, a model where cultural diversity is celebrated by elites, while economic inequality deepens. In such systems, social justice becomes a brand, stripped of its redistributive power. For Fraser, the future of justice depends on a new kind of coalition, one that refuses to choose between class and culture, one that sees economic and identity-based struggles not as rivals, but as co-conspirators in building a more equal world. Because when dignity and security are divided, neither can truly thrive. Fraser's vision asks us to stop drawing lines between the social and the economic, the symbolic and the material. It demands a politics that sees the whole person and the full complexity of what justice requires. Butler's Performativity and Power, How Identity Became a Battleground. You step into a room and speak your name. You wear a uniform, walk a certain way, address people with practiced words. None of this feels unusual. It's just who you are. Or is it? Judith Butler, a political and gender theorist, would invite you to look again. Her theory of performativity suggests that identity, especially gender, is not something we are, but something we do. It is not a static truth inside us. It's a set of repeated acts, stylized over time, shaped by norms, expectations, and invisible scripts. You weren't simply born into a gender. You were trained into one. From the moment you're labeled boy or girl, society begins to instruct how to move, how to dress, how to speak, how to desire. These performances, repeated daily, create the illusion of a stable identity. And because these performances are reinforced by institutions, schools, media, religion, they become hard to question. Butler doesn't mean performance as in faking. She means that power operates through repetition. And through that repetition, it shapes what feels natural. We are not just expressing identities, we are continually producing them. This idea doesn't stop at gender. It extends to all forms of political life. Citizenship is performed. Race is marked and enforced through cultural codes. Even nationhood is sustained through rituals, holidays, anthems, and shared fictions. For Butler, performativity reveals that what seems foundational is often fragile. Identity is not a given, it's a doing, and if it is a doing, it can be undone, reimagined, resisted. This is where her theory intersects with power. Because norms are enforced not just with violence, but with shame, exclusion, ridicule, and resisting them often carries a cost. To break the script is to risk being read as unintelligible, as someone who doesn't make sense in the social order. But it is in this rupture, Butler argues, that transformation becomes possible. In the failure of the script, we find its boundaries, and in those boundaries, the chance to redraw them. Her work offers not a fixed roadmap for liberation, but a constant interrogation of how identities are made, constrained, and sometimes set free. Power doesn't just punish, it defines. And to question those definitions is to open a crack in the structure of the political world itself. Chantal Mouffe's agonistic pluralism. Why consensus can be dangerous in a democracy. You walk into a public debate. The atmosphere is tense, but focused. Two sides argue passionately, not to destroy each other, but to be heard. There are no easy resolutions, but no silencing either. This is not dysfunction. This, for political theorist Chantal Mouffe, is democracy working as it should. Mouffe challenges the ideal that politics should aim for pure consensus. In fact, she believes that attempts to erase disagreement often result in something more dangerous: suppression, resentment, or the rise of extremism. Her idea of agonistic pluralism is built around a central truth. Conflict is not a flaw of democracy, it is its lifeblood. Agonism is not war. It is not hatred. It is struggle between adversaries who respect each other's right to exist. It is conflict within bounds. The acknowledgement that in a pluralistic society, not everyone will share the same values, beliefs, or visions of the good life. Where liberal theorists often seek a neutral space for rational debate, Mouffe argues that no space is ever truly neutral. Every framework privileges certain values, certain ways of speaking, certain forms of power. Trying to enforce harmony, she says, doesn't eliminate conflict, it just drives it underground, where it festers. Agonistic pluralism, then, is about creating arenas where genuine disagreement can happen without descending into violence, where passion and identity have room to breathe, where people don't have to sanitize their beliefs to fit some artificial center. For Mouffe, politics is always about drawing lines, but the question is how we draw them and whether we treat those on the other side as enemies to be destroyed or adversaries to be engaged. She sees danger in the rise of post-political technocracy, governments that promise efficiency but erase real ideological struggle. When citizens feel they have no voice, no meaningful alternative, they turn to those who promise to fight. The solution isn't to shut down strong emotions in politics, it's to channel them into democratic forms. Passion must be acknowledged, not pathologized. Mouffe reminds us that real democracy doesn't mean everyone agrees. It means everyone has space to disagree without being erased. And that in honoring our differences, we preserve the fragile, necessary tension that keeps the political world alive. Plato's philosopher king. The dream of rule by wisdom. A city lies in turmoil, corrupted by greed, misled by orators, divided by passions. In the midst of this confusion, Plato imagined a different kind of ruler. Not a soldier, not a merchant, not a populist crowd pleaser, but a philosopher. Someone trained not in tactics or charisma, but in truth. In the Republic, Plato described his vision of the ideal city, a society governed by reason, where justice is not merely enforced, but understood. At the top of this hierarchy sat the philosopher king, a ruler who loves wisdom, not power. For Plato, most people are trapped in illusion. Like prisoners in a cave, they mistake shadows for reality. The philosopher, however, turns toward the light, ascending through education and contemplation to grasp the eternal forms, timeless truths beyond the world of appearances. And because the philosopher sees what is real and good, he alone is fit to rule. Plato's vision is not democratic. It does not rest on votes or popularity. It rests on the assumption that most people do not know what is best for them, and that wisdom, not will, should guide the state. The philosopher king is reluctant to govern. He would rather contemplate than command. But in Plato's eyes, this reluctance is exactly what makes him qualified. Those who desire power the most are least suited to wield it. This ideal raises unsettling questions. Should the wise have authority over the many? Is justice better served by knowledge than by choice? And can philosophy ever survive contact with political reality? Throughout history, Plato's dream has tempted rulers and thinkers alike. From Islamic philosopher Al-Farabi to Enlightenment theorists, the idea of governance by reason has returned again and again. But critics have warned of its dangers. When leaders believe they alone possess truth, dissent becomes ignorance, and when the people are seen as needing guidance, their agency can be dismissed. Plato's philosopher king reminds us of a deeper tension in political life, the pull between wisdom and participation, between expertise and consent. It asks us to reflect on the foundations of authority, not just who rules, but why they should, and whether a society built on truth can ever be reconciled with one built on freedom. Aristotle's polity and civic virtue, the balance between rule of law and human flourishing. The city for Aristotle was not just a place to live, it was a space to become fully human. In his Politics, Aristotle described humans as zoon politikon, political animals, not because we vote or debate, but because we thrive through collective life. We achieve our highest potential, he believed, not in solitude but in community. And at the heart of a flourishing community is polity, a mixed form of government balanced between the extremes of rule by the few and rule by the many. Unlike Plato, who dreamed of ideal forms, Aristotle worked with what he observed. He studied existing city-states and recognized that pure democracy could lead to mob rule, while oligarchy could serve only the rich. His solution was moderation, a government by the many, but with constitutional restraints, shared duties, and a strong middle class. A healthy polity for Aristotle is not just about structure, it is about virtue. Citizens must not only follow laws, but cultivate the habits of good character. Courage, justice, prudence, generosity. These were not private virtues, but public necessities. The purpose of politics, then, was not merely to prevent chaos or secure rights. It was to shape the moral life of its people. Education, public festivals, the design of the city, all had a role in forming citizens who could govern themselves and care for the common good. Freedom, in this view, is not the absence of interference. It is the capacity to live wisely and well. Aristotle feared that when citizens cared only for their private interests, the city would fracture. When people stopped engaging in public life, stopped cultivating virtue, the state would decay from within. He placed great hope in the mesoi, the middle class, neither too rich to dominate, nor too poor to be desperate. They would bring balance, stability, and commitment to the community. In Aristotle's world, citizenship was an active role, not just a legal status, but a practice. Something you lived, something you earned by contributing to the shared life of the polis. His vision is demanding. It requires more than policy. It demands character. And it poses a quiet question to us still. Can a democracy endure if its citizens no longer seek to be good? And if freedom is not paired with virtue, what kind of society will that freedom ultimately build? Hobbes Leviathan. Why we surrender liberty for order. Imagine the world without government. No police, no courts, no state, just individuals, each free to act as they please, each driven by hunger, fear, and ambition. Thomas Hobbes called this the state of nature, and in his eyes it was a nightmare. Without a central authority to impose order, Hobbes believed life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Not because people are evil by nature, but because in a world of total freedom and scarcity, trust collapses. Even the peaceful must prepare for war. Every encounter becomes a potential threat. Self-preservation overrides cooperation. No one can sleep soundly while armed neighbors watch the door. Out of this grim vision, Hobbes crafted one of the most influential arguments for state power ever written. In his 1651 work Leviathan, he proposed a radical solution. Individuals should surrender their natural rights to a sovereign, a single absolute authority who could impose peace and prevent mutual destruction. This sovereign could be a king, an assembly, or any strong institution. What mattered was not who ruled, but that someone did. Authority had to be undivided, decisive, and above all, obeyed. For Hobbes, divided rule was weak rule, an invitation to collapse. Liberty and order in Hobbes's view were not natural companions. Freedom without control led to chaos. To be free within society, people had to first give up the dangerous freedom of the wilderness. True liberty was not doing whatever one wanted. It was having the security to live without constant fear. The state, in Hobbes's model, was not a moral guide. It did not aim to cultivate virtue, as Aristotle had imagined. It was a giant machine, constructed to solve a problem, how to keep people from killing each other. It was a necessary artifice, born not from idealism but desperation. He called it the Leviathan, a mortal god made of the people, for the people, but above the people. Its legitimacy came not from divine right, but from the rational agreement of fearful individuals seeking safety. In submitting to its power, they were not abandoning reason, but following it to its harshest conclusion. This idea, the social contract, would echo through political theory for centuries. It would inspire later thinkers like Locke and Rousseau, even as they rejected Hobbes's absolutism, and it would shape the foundations of modern statehood, from constitutional monarchies to national security states. Hobbes's Leviathan remains controversial. Its image of human nature is bleak, its tolerance for authority is vast, but it forces a fundamental question. What are we willing to trade for peace? And can freedom truly survive without the shadow of a sovereign to contain it? Locke's natural rights, the roots of constitutional liberalism. You wake up in a home you own, speak freely about your beliefs, and go to work where your time is exchanged for wages. None of this feels revolutionary, but in the 17th century, it was. John Locke, writing in the aftermath of civil war and monarchy's collapse, proposed a new foundation for political life, one not rooted in divine rule or inherited power, but in individual rights. He began with a different picture of the state of nature than Hobbes. For Locke, the natural state of humanity was not war, but freedom. People were born with certain rights, not granted by kings, but inherent to their existence: life, liberty, and property. These rights were not abstract ideals. They were entitlements that no one, not a king, not a parliament, had the right to violate. Government, Locke argued, exists only to protect those rights. Its legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed. If a ruler becomes a threat to life, liberty, or property, the people not only have the right to resist, they have the duty to overthrow. This was a radical notion. It justified rebellion against tyranny. It placed limits on power. It imagined a contract not of fear but of trust. Where Hobbes saw the sovereign as an absolute force against chaos, Locke saw government as a servant, a tool constructed to preserve natural law. Power must be restrained by laws, divided among branches, and subject to the will of the people. His vision inspired revolutions. The American Declaration of Independence echoes his language. Liberal democracies, with their constitutions and checks on power, carry his imprint. But Locke's legacy is not without complication. While he spoke of liberty, he also defended colonial conquest and justified slavery. His concept of property included land taken from those he deemed uncivilized. Like many Enlightenment thinkers, his universalism coexisted with deep exclusions. Still, Locke's core insight remains foundational, that individuals are not tools of the state, but holders of rights the state must protect. It is a vision that continues to animate debates over justice, legitimacy, and freedom. And it leaves us with a question that has not faded. What happens when the state forgets its purpose? And who decides when trust has been broken? Rousseau's general will, freedom as obedience to ourselves. You stand in a crowded square. Around you, voices clash, people argue, chant, demand, and amid this noise, a strange idea takes shape. Not consensus, not uniformity, but a will that belongs to everyone and no one at once. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's general will, a concept as radical as it is elusive. In The Social Contract, Rousseau sought to answer an ancient question: how can we be free in a society? How can we obey laws and still be self-governing? His answer was that true freedom is not found in doing whatever we want. It is found in obeying laws we prescribe for ourselves. And when those laws reflect the general will, not individual desires but the shared interest of all, we are most free. The general will is not the sum of private opinions. It is not majority rule. It is a deeper unity that emerges when citizens consider what is best for the whole, not just for themselves. This requires a transformation. Citizens must move beyond private interests. They must imagine themselves as part of a collective body, a people. When they do, their shared vision becomes law, not imposed from above, but generated from within. For Rousseau, sovereignty resides not in a ruler or a parliament, but in the people acting as a single moral agent. And because sovereignty cannot be divided, it cannot be transferred. Representatives may carry out the general will, but they do not own it. This vision electrified revolutionary movements. It offered a path to self-rule, rooted not in wealth or birth, but in participation. The general will promised legitimacy without monarchy, order without oppression. But it also carried danger. If the general will is always right, what happens to those who dissent? Rousseau admitted that some may need to be forced to be free, a phrase that has haunted his legacy ever since. In the name of unity, pluralism can be silenced. In the pursuit of the common good, individual liberty can be crushed. The French Revolution would echo Rousseau's ideas and also reveal their peril. The general will, unmoored from accountability, could justify terror as easily as it could inspire equality. Yet Rousseau's question remains vital. How can a society be more than a marketplace of interests? How can we be bound together not just by law, but by purpose? He reminds us that democracy is not simply a mechanism. It is a moral endeavor, a call to imagine ourselves as part of something larger than the self. And he leaves us with a tension that still shapes every republic. Can freedom survive unity? And can unity survive freedom? Hume's conventional authority, power that rests on familiarity, not force. You obey the traffic light, you wait in line, you pay your taxes, sign your contracts, and keep your word. But why? What holds these obligations in place? Is it fear, morality, divine command? David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, offered a quieter answer: habit and convention. For Hume, political authority does not descend from heaven, nor does it emerge from some abstract social contract drawn up in a single dramatic moment. It grows gradually through custom, repeated behavior that becomes expectation, then obligation, then law. In his treatise of human nature and political essays, Hume challenged the rationalist fantasies of his time. He argued that humans are not cold calculators of logic. We are creatures of emotion shaped by experience, guided more by what feels stable and familiar than what is perfectly reasoned. So too with power. Governments endure not because they are ideal, but because they are established. We obey not because we are always convinced, but because we are conditioned. Hume rejected the notion that political authority must always be justified by natural rights or metaphysical claims. Instead, he looked to utility, the usefulness of government in preserving order, ensuring stability, and allowing society to function. Legitimacy, in his view, is not eternal. It is practical. The state, like property or money, is a useful fiction, something we all agree to treat as real, and in doing so, make it real. But this doesn't mean Hume was a cynic. He believed that conventions, when rooted in long-term public interest, could evolve into something like justice. Institutions, traditions, even monarchies, if they proved to be stable and beneficial, could be accepted without divine sanction or philosophical purity. What mattered was whether they worked. This view was conservative in tone, but deeply influential. It offered a framework for political legitimacy that did not require revolution or revelation. It explained why people follow rulers they may not love and why systems persist long after their origin myths have faded. Hume's insight is subtle but powerful. Authority lasts not because it is perfect, but because it becomes familiar. The force of habit, the momentum of expectation, and the shared belief in continuity, all these make politics possible. And yet, this vision also leaves a lingering question. If authority is just a convention, what happens when that convention breaks? And who gets to decide when it no longer serves? Al-Farabi's Virtuous City, Islamic Foundations of Statecraft. Imagine a city not ruled by force or fear, but by wisdom, a place where leadership is measured not by lineage or wealth, but by philosophical insight and moral clarity. This was the vision of Al-Farabi, the 10th-century Islamic philosopher who sought to merge Greek rationalism with prophetic guidance. In his seminal work, The Virtuous City, Al-Farabi reimagined Plato's ideal polis for an Islamic world. He described a society ordered around truth, justice, and the cultivation of the soul, where politics was not a competition for power, but a structure for human perfection. The goal of the city, he believed, was not just material security, but spiritual fulfillment. A good society, like a good soul, must be harmonized. Each class, each function, must play its role with precision and purpose, guided by an overarching vision of the good. At the top of this order stood the ideal ruler, not a tyrant, not a mere administrator, but a philosopher-prophet, someone with both intellectual excellence and divine insight. A rare combination, but essential for guiding the community toward its ultimate purpose. Unlike Plato's aloof philosopher king, Al-Farabi's leader was deeply tied to prophecy. Revelation and reason were not in conflict. They were two paths toward the same truth. In his synthesis, divine law provided the moral compass, while reason ensured its wise application. He drew heavily on Aristotle and Plato, but placed their insights within an Islamic framework. Politics for Al-Farabi was an extension of ethics, and ethics ultimately was about aligning the human soul with the order of the universe. The Virtuous City was not a utopia. It was a model, a guide for how real communities might approximate the ideal. And like the soul, cities could be sick or healthy, just or corrupt. The worst city, in his taxonomy, was not ruled by cruelty, but by ignorance, where leaders lacked vision and citizens lived only for pleasure or wealth. Al-Farabi's influence rippled across the Islamic world. He helped lay the intellectual groundwork for later thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes, and his integration of reason and revelation inspired both medieval Islamic philosophy and later European thought. In an age of fragmented politics and spiritual confusion, Al-Farabi offered a bold reminder that true leadership requires more than charisma or command. It requires a deep understanding of what it means to live well and a commitment to help others do the same. Montesquieu's separation of powers, the invisible scaffolding of modern democracies. In the ruins of absolutism, Charles Louis II, Baron de Montesquieu, looked for something sturdier than royal will, something that could restrain power without destroying it. He found it not in revolution but in balance. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu laid out a framework that would reshape modern political thought, the separation of powers. He argued that political liberty is best preserved when power is divided, not concentrated in the hands of a single ruler, institution, or group. When legislative, executive, and judicial functions are separated and kept in check by one another, tyranny becomes more difficult and freedom more secure. He was inspired by the British constitutional monarchy, with its system of monarchy, parliament, and courts. But his idea was more than imitation. It was a theory of how to manage the dangerous energy of political power. Montesquieu saw that unchecked power tends to expand. It does not willingly limit itself. So, the only effective constraint is other power. Just as nature balances forces, heat and cold, light and dark, so must governments balance ambition with ambition. For him, liberty was not the absence of interference, but security from arbitrary domination. A person is free when they do not fear that a ruler, a judge, or a lawmaker might suddenly crush their rights. This structural vision would echo through the American and French revolutions. It became the backbone of constitutional democracies. It influenced the framers of the U.S. Constitution, who embedded checks and balances into its architecture. But Montesquieu's philosophy is more than legal design. It is a warning about human nature. Even well-intentioned leaders are tempted by control. Even noble causes can justify overreach. So liberty must not depend on virtue alone. It must be built into the system itself. His vision is not utopian. It accepts conflict, tension, and inefficiency as the price of freedom. It values procedures over passion and limits over loyalty. And it reminds us that democracy is not self-sustaining. It must be engineered, maintained, and watched with care. Because once power slips from balance, it rarely returns without cost. And history has shown, time and again, that the fall of political systems often begins not with collapse, but with decay, an insight that leads us directly to the next thinker who mapped the rise and fall of entire civilizations, Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun's cyclical dynasties, how empires are born, rise, and fall. Across deserts and river valleys, from empires rising in glory to cities falling into silence, Ibn Khaldun saw a pattern, a rhythm to history. Not linear progress, not random chaos, but cycles, predictable, painful, and endlessly repeated. Writing in the 14th century, this North African scholar offered one of the earliest and most detailed theories of political history in his Muqaddimah. At the center of it was a concept he called asabiyya, social cohesion, the bond that holds people together. For Ibn Khaldun, every great dynasty begins with strong group solidarity. A tribe or small community, hardened by struggle and bound by loyalty, rises with discipline and shared purpose. This asabiyya gives them strength to conquer, organize, and rule. But power changes people. Once in control, The ruling group begins to soften. Luxury replaces discipline. Personal interest replaces common cause. The children of warriors become courtiers. The Bond phrase. To maintain authority, rulers begin to rely more on coercion and bureaucracy than loyalty. Corruption spreads. Ambition outpaces wisdom. And eventually, a new group, united, hungrier, less refined, rises to challenge the decaying regime. The cycle begins again. Ibn Khaldun's theory was not fatalistic. He did not believe that decline was inevitable, but he saw clearly how success carries the seeds of its own undoing. He rejected the idealistic narratives of his time. Empires, he argued, do not rise because of divine favor or moral superiority. They rise because of cohesion, and they fall when that cohesion dissolves. His insights stretched beyond politics. He examined economics, education, climate, and culture. He laid foundations for modern sociology centuries before the word existed. In many ways, Ibn Khaldun anticipated thinkers like Machiavelli and Toynbee, but his vision was grounded in an Islamic framework shaped by the shifting fortunes of the Maghreb and the larger Muslim world. He understood that human history was not just a record of kings and battles, but of patterns rooted in human nature, repeated across generations. And he left us with a question that haunts every thriving civilization. How long before success turns to softness? And what holds a society together when the force that built it begins to fade? Herder's cultural nationalism, nationhood as shared soul, not just soil. Walk through a village untouched by empire. Hear the lullabies sung in a language spoken nowhere else. Smell the bread, shaped by centuries of tradition. Listen to the stories passed down not by kings, but by grandmothers. For Johann Gottfried Herder, these are not quaint details, they are the soul of a people. In the late 18th century, as Enlightenment thinkers celebrated universal reason and abstract rights, Herder turned toward the particular. He believed that every people, every Volk, had its own spirit, its own rhythm, its own Weltanschauung or worldview. This wasn't about race or blood, it was about shared language, memory, ritual, and place. Culture, to Herder, was not decoration, it was destiny. He opposed the idea that one civilization could be the yardstick for all others. There was no single path to progress, no master model to imitate. Each nation had a right to flourish in its own way, according to its own inner logic. This was a gentle nationalism at first. Herder saw cultural identity as something to be preserved, not weaponized. He dreamed of a mosaic, not a hierarchy. A world where difference was honored, not erased. But his ideas would take on a life of their own. What began as a defense of folk culture became, in later hands, a justification for exclusion. Romantic nationalism, drawing on Herder's spirit, would swell into movements that saw outsiders as threats and purity as sacred. Still, Herder's original vision speaks to a real longing, the need for rootedness in an age of abstraction. He saw that empires could flatten identity, that cosmopolitan ideals, however noble, often overlooked the power of belonging. He also influenced thinkers far beyond Europe, post-colonial writers, indigenous revivalists, and cultural theorists who argued that identity is not just individual, but inherited. Herder forces us to ask, what makes a people a people? And can we love our culture without needing to conquer with it? His nationalism was not about supremacy, it was about memory, a call to honor the songs, the idioms, the small rituals that hold a community together across time. But as history would soon show, the line between pride and power is thin. And in the next reflection, we step into a far more explosive theory of history, one that would challenge not just nations but the very structure of economic life, Marx's historical materialism. Marx's historical materialism, how economics fuels every revolution. Imagine peeling back the myths of civilization, not to reveal kings or prophets, but something more basic, labor. For Karl Marx, history was not driven by ideals or great individuals. It was driven by material conditions, by how people produce, survive, and work. This was the core of historical materialism, Marx's method for understanding the evolution of societies. At its heart was a simple, disruptive claim that human history is shaped by economic forces, that beneath every law, religion, or cultural norm lies the structure of production. In Marx's view, each stage of history is defined by a particular mode of production, tribal, slave-based, feudal, capitalist, and each mode contains its own internal tensions. Over time, these tensions sharpen into conflict. Class conflict. The ruling class owns the means of production, land, factories, capital. The working class, or proletariat, owns only their labor. This imbalance creates exploitation, which in turn generates resistance. Marx believed that capitalism, like the systems before it, was not eternal. It was historical. It emerged under specific conditions, solved certain problems, and would one day give way to something new. What made capitalism unique, however, was its dynamism. It revolutionized everything it touched: technology, markets, even social relations. But in doing so, it also created alienation. Workers were disconnected from the products they made, from each other, from their own potential. Historical materialism did not merely describe this process, it predicted its outcome. Marx believed that capitalism's contradictions would eventually become unbearable. The proletariat would become conscious of its position and rise in revolution, seizing the means of production and ushering in a classless communist society. This was not a moral plea, it was a claim about inevitability. Revolution, Marx argued, was not a choice. It was a stage in the dialectic, a necessary outcome of historical forces. Critics have challenged this determinism. History has not unfolded as Marx envisioned, but his influence endures. He gave language to exploitation, to inequality, to the idea that behind every political structure lies an economic engine. Historical materialism remains one of the most powerful tools for analyzing how power flows, not just through parliaments or armies, but through wages, rent, and debt. And it leaves us with a burning question. If the world we live in is built on exploitation, what comes after we see it clearly? And who will lead the charge toward something new? That question brings us to the next stage of the revolutionary arc, Lenin's theory of the vanguard. Lenin's vanguardism, the case for rule by the politically awakened. Picture a crowd in revolt, workers marching, flags raised, anger rising. But in the chaos, something's missing: direction. For Vladimir Lenin, revolution required more than rage. It required discipline, strategy, a guide. That guide was the vanguard party, a central concept in Lenin's vision of revolutionary politics. While Marx believed revolution would emerge organically from class struggle, Lenin saw things differently. He believed that left to their own devices, the working class would only achieve trade union consciousness, a desire for better wages, safer conditions, incremental reform. What was needed, Lenin argued, was revolutionary consciousness, a clear understanding of capitalism's structure and a commitment to overthrow it, and that consciousness would not arise spontaneously. It had to be introduced from outside by a tightly organized, ideologically trained minority, the vanguard. This vanguard would not simply represent the workers, it would lead them, it would educate, agitate, and coordinate action across the masses. It would serve as the nerve center of the revolution. In his 1902 pamphlet, What is to be Done?, Lenin emphasized the need for a professional revolutionary organization, not a loose movement, but a disciplined force. Politics was not a waiting game. It was a battle, and battles required command. The vanguard was the antidote to spontaneity, to compromise, to drift. It was the engine of historical change, built not on numbers, but on clarity. This model would shape the Russian Revolution and inspire communist movements around the globe. But it also came with dangers. By placing revolutionary truth in the hands of a few, vanguardism risked replacing one form of domination with another. The party that claimed to speak for the people could begin speaking over them. Critics warned of elitism, of centralization, of the seeds of authoritarianism planted in revolutionary soil. Still, for Lenin, the stakes were too high for hesitation. History would not wait for consensus. It demanded action, and someone had to act first. Vanguardism posed a fundamental challenge to democratic ideals. It asked, can the masses liberate themselves, or must they be led? And if so, who leads the leaders? As communist revolutions spread, this question would take new forms, especially in China, where Mao Zedong offered a different answer. Not top-down leadership, but something more dynamic, a strategy he called the mass line. Mao's mass line. How authority pretends to listen. Deep in the countryside, revolution brews, not in the urban factories Marx once imagined, but in rice fields, among peasants, soldiers, and rural workers. For Mao Zedong, the Chinese path to communism would not begin with theory. It would begin with the people. And yet, leadership was still necessary. The challenge was how to lead without disconnecting, how to guide the masses without speaking over them. Mao's answer was the mass line, a method of political leadership designed to keep the party rooted in the lived experiences of ordinary people. From the masses to the masses, Mao wrote, the idea was simple in form, but profound in implication. First, cadres would go among the people, not to preach, but to listen. They would gather opinions, concerns, grievances, ideas. This raw material was then distilled by the party leadership into coherent policy or strategy, shaped by socialist theory and revolutionary goals. Then, the refined line would be brought back to the people, not imposed from above, but reintroduced, tested, discussed, and refined again. This circular movement created a feedback loop between leadership and base. It was meant to prevent bureaucracy from hardening, to keep revolution alive and adaptable. Theory in this model was not abstract dogma. It was forged in the heat of daily struggle. Unlike Lenin's centralized vanguard, Mao's mass line insisted on continuous dialogue. Leadership was not about commanding, but about interpreting and returning. The party was both guide and student. But the mass line was not free from contradiction. In practice, the distinction between distilling ideas and controlling them often blurred. During campaigns like the Cultural Revolution, Mao invoked the mass line even as dissent was crushed and chaos reigned. Listening turned selective. Feedback loops collapsed into slogans. Still, the concept holds deep insight. It recognizes that revolutions cannot sustain themselves from above. They must constantly renew their connection to those they claim to serve. Mao's mass line asks, can power remain humble? Can leadership listen without filtering truth through ideology? And can revolution be shaped not just by commands, but by conversation? These questions would be echoed, inverted, and radicalized by another revolutionary, Mikhail Bakunin, who believed that the very act of leading was itself a form of domination. Bakunin's anti-authoritarianism. The state must be abolished, not seized. Imagine a revolution. The people rise, the old regime falls, the flag changes, but the chains remain. New rulers, new uniforms, the same structure. For Mikhail Bakunin, this was the tragedy of most revolutions. They replaced one hierarchy with another. A Russian anarchist and fierce critic of both monarchy and Marxism, Bakunin believed that any concentration of political power, no matter how well-intentioned, would eventually turn against the people. Where Marx trusted the dictatorship of the proletariat to build a classless society, Bakunin saw only the seeds of a new elite, intellectuals and party officials who would become the next oppressors. The danger wasn't capitalism alone, it was authority itself. Bakunin's vision of liberation was radical. He called not for the seizure of the state, but for its destruction, not for the capture of power, but for its dissolution. He believed that real freedom required the abolition of centralized authority. In its place, he imagined a federation of autonomous communities organized through voluntary association, direct democracy, and mutual aid. No masters, no vanguards, no imposed hierarchies. Bakunin placed his faith in the instincts of ordinary people. He saw in peasants and workers a capacity for self-governance that needed no philosophers or parties to interpret reality on their behalf. Unlike the scientific socialism of Marx, his was a visceral rebellion fueled by distrust of abstraction and a hatred for domination in all forms. He warned that revolutionary leaders, once in power, would begin to speak not for the people, but instead as the people. They would call dissent counter-revolutionary, enforce doctrine through bureaucracy, and slowly reassemble the machinery of control. Bakunin's writings were chaotic, fiery, sometimes self-contradictory, but his warnings proved prophetic. In the wake of Marxist revolutions, many of the abuses he feared came to pass. His legacy influenced anarchist movements across the world, from syndicalist labor struggles to modern anti-authoritarian organizing. He asks us to consider a question that goes deeper than who holds power. What if power itself is the problem? And if true freedom lies beyond the state, what new forms of solidarity must we imagine? For another revolutionary, Frantz Fanon, the question was not how to dismantle authority, but how to reclaim it from centuries of racial domination. His answer would not come through dialogue, but through decolonial violence. Fanon's decolonial violence, the brutal price of reclaiming dignity. You live in a land where your language is mocked, your skin is feared, your name is mispronounced. You are told that your past was primitive, your culture backward, your future dependent on permission. And yet, behind the silence, something simmers. Frantz Fanon, a psychiatrist, philosopher, and revolutionary, gave voice to that simmering. In The Wretched of the Earth, he argued that colonialism is not merely political domination, it is psychological warfare. It degrades not only bodies, but identities. It colonizes the mind. For Fanon, the violence of colonization cannot be reversed through negotiation or reform. It must be met with counter-violence. Liberation is not granted, it is seized. He did not celebrate bloodshed for its own sake, but he insisted that decolonization is always a violent event, not only because the colonizer will not relinquish control, but because the colonized must break the internalized image of inferiority that colonization has etched into their souls. In a world divided between settler and native, oppressor and oppressed, Fanon saw violence as a process of self-reconstruction. The act of rebellion was also an act of becoming. In rising up, the colonized reclaims agency, dignity, and subjectivity. This view was controversial, and remains so. Critics accused Fanon of romanticizing violence. But Fanon saw violence already embedded in the colonial structure. The plantation, the prison, the checkpoint, the slum, all enforced by force. He argued that the colonizer speaks the language of domination. And sometimes the only language the colonizer will answer is force. But Fanon's vision went further. He warned that after independence, new elites might replace old masters, that liberation could turn into mimicry, that if the revolution did not rebuild economic justice, cultural confidence, and political autonomy, it would fail in spirit, even if it succeeded in name. He called for a new humanism, born not in European salons, but in the ashes of empire. One that would not replicate colonial categories, but transcend them. One that would heal the psyche, as well as liberate the land. Fanon forces us to ask, when the system that defines you degrades you, what is the cost of reclaiming your name? And when history has been written against you, is violence the only pen strong enough to write a new beginning? But if Fanon gave voice to the fire of rebirth, the next thinker offered a much colder view, a civilization not rising but decaying, a twilight theory of decline from Oswald Spengler. Spengler's civilizational decline, when culture becomes graveyard, You walk through a great city. The architecture still stands, the markets still hum, the laws are still obeyed, but something feels off. The soul is gone. The rhythm of creation has slowed. What remains is memory, repetition, and the quiet glide toward dusk. This was the vision of Oswald Spengler, the German historian and philosopher who wrote The Decline of the West. For Spengler, civilizations are not engines of endless progress. They are organisms. They are born, they grow, they flower, and eventually they die. Spengler rejected the Enlightenment idea of linear history. He saw instead a series of cultural life forms, Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, Greco-Roman, Western, each with its own soul, its own destiny. Each passes through seasons, spring awakening, summer expansion, autumn maturity, and winter decline. For him, the West had entered winter. He believed that the creative energy that once defined Europe, its art, philosophy, religion, had hardened into mechanical routine. Politics had become administration, culture had become commerce, cities had become sprawling masses, cut off from their rural roots. In Spengler's view, democracy was a transitional phase, not a permanent achievement. It gave way to Caesarism, a return of strongmen, spectacle, and mass manipulation. This was not a prophecy born of nostalgia. It was a cold, sweeping interpretation of history's inner logic. Spengler did not offer salvation. He offered perspective. To him, decline was not failure. It was natural. The fruit ripens, falls, and fertilizes the ground. Critics saw in his theory a justification for authoritarianism, a rejection of Enlightenment ideals, a dangerous romanticism of the past. His work was complex, sometimes contradictory, admired by some conservatives, co-opted by fascists, and challenged by progressives. But his central insight continues to haunt. What if civilizations are not meant to last forever? And what if trying to preserve them past their prime only accelerates their decay? Spengler invites us to consider the limits of growth, to question whether our institutions are still alive or merely sustained by momentum. And as his vision turns westward, toward an exhausted Europe, another voice rises from the south. Kwame Nkrumah, speaking from a newly independent Ghana, dared to imagine a rebirth not of empire but of African unity, a future shaped not by imitation but by African socialism. Nkrumah's African socialism, power without Western blueprints. The flag is new. The anthem plays. The colonizer has left. And yet in the banks, the contracts, the schools, and the roads, his presence lingers. Independence has been won, but not yet built. This was the challenge Kwame Nkrumah faced as the first leader of post-colonial Ghana. Nkrumah believed that political liberation was only the first step. Without economic justice and cultural reclamation, independence would be hollow. To fill that void, he proposed a vision he called African socialism, not as a carbon copy of European Marxism, but as something rooted in the continent's own traditions and struggles. Drawing from Pan-Africanism, anti-imperialism, and indigenous communalism, Nkrumah imagined a socialism that emphasized unity over class war, development over dogma, and sovereignty over foreign alignment. He argued that pre-colonial African societies had long practiced collective ownership and shared labor. These systems, though disrupted by colonialism, offered a foundation for a new economic model, one that avoided both Western capitalism and Soviet-style centralization. But Nkrumah was not merely nostalgic. He believed African socialism had to be modern, planned, and scientifically organized. His government invested in education, infrastructure, and industrialization, aiming to transform Ghana into a beacon for the rest of the continent. Pan-Africanism was central. Nkrumah dreamed of a unified Africa, politically federated, economically self-reliant, and culturally confident. He saw colonial borders as artificial wounds and believed that only continental solidarity could protect Africa from neo-colonial control. Yet his ambition came at a cost. As his government expanded its reach, Dissent was suppressed. A one-party state emerged. Critics accused him of centralizing power in the name of unity. By 1966, a coup backed in part by foreign interests removed him from power. But the idea he championed did not die. It lives on in the debates over post-colonial identity, economic independence, and continental integration. Nkrumah's African socialism asks us to imagine what liberation means beyond flags and parades. Can a people be truly free if they do not control their own economy? Can modernity be shaped by tradition rather than replacing it? And how does a continent write its future when so much of its past was written for it? If Nkrumah dreamed of unity through the state, another movement, Zapatismo, would emerge decades later, seeking liberation from the state entirely. Zapatismo, revolution without hierarchy. In the misty highlands of Chiapas, Mexico, a voice emerged not from capitals or conference halls, but from behind a mask. A pipe in his mouth, books in his hands. Subcomandante Marcos stood not as a leader above, but a symbol within, a movement known as Zapatismo. Named after Emiliano Zapata, the revolutionary peasant leader of the Mexican Revolution, Zapatismo reappeared in 1994 as the EZLN Zapatista Army of National Liberation. On the very day NAFTA took effect, they rose not against an old colonial power but against neoliberalism itself, against a global system that made promises of prosperity while eroding local control, culture, and life. Their uprising wasn't about taking power. It was about creating space. Space to live with dignity, space to speak in their own voice, in their own language, on their own land. Zapatismo fused indigenous cosmology with radical politics. It offered no blueprint, no grand theory, no manifest destiny. Instead, it offered something more unsettling, an open invitation to rethink power from the ground up. The Zapatistas rejected traditional leftist models of revolution. They didn't seize the state. They sidestepped it. They didn't build a party. They built caracoles, autonomous zones governed through assemblies, rotation of leadership, and deep consultation with communities. They moved slowly, deliberately, always in dialogue. They called their path walking while questioning. Communication was central. Marcos wrote poetic communiques, weaving myth, humor, and parable into a resistance narrative that resonated globally. The mask became a symbol not of hiding, but of speaking on behalf of the many whose faces had been rendered invisible. Zapatismo spread across borders, inspiring global justice movements, Occupy encampments, and decentralized activism. It was not a model to copy, but a rhythm to feel. Critics called it theatrical, symbolic, limited. But in a world obsessed with speed and spectacle, Zapatismo reminded us that dignity is not delivered by decree. It is practiced in meetings, markets, and the quiet refusal to be erased. Their presence posed a simple, disarming question. What if revolution is not a moment, but a way of being? And what if resistance begins not with seizing the palace, but with rebuilding the village? If Zapatismo blurred the line between tradition and rebellion, the next thinker, Homi Bhabha, would challenge the boundaries between colonizer and colonized, speaking through the layered lens of post-colonial hybridity. Bhabha's post-colonial hybridity, identity born at the edge of empire. A child grows up in a house where two languages are spoken, one at home, one at school. Their clothes blend symbols from both cultures. Their name is mispronounced in one tongue, corrected in another. They do not feel lost, but they do not feel whole either. They live in between. For Homi Bhabha, this space is not a failure. It is a frontier. A leading figure in post-colonial theory, Bhabha introduced the concept of hybridity, a way of understanding identity, not as pure or singular, but as mixed, shifting, negotiated. In the encounter between colonizer and colonized, he argued, something new emerges, not dominance or resistance alone, but a third space where meaning is unsettled. This third space is where cultural translation happens. It is where colonial discourse is repeated but altered, mimicked but subverted. It is not simply rebellion. It is interruption, a pause in the narrative where power stutters. Baba drew from Freud, Lacan, and Derrida, layering psychoanalysis and deconstruction onto the politics of empire. He argued that colonial authority is never as stable as it seems. It depends on mimicry, on the colonized repeating the forms of the colonizer, but never quite fully. That not quite is the crack where hybridity lives. The colonizer demands sameness, but fears it. Wants imitation, but dreads being replaced. Hybridity reveals this anxiety, not with loud resistance, but with subtle distortions that challenge the claim of cultural purity. For Baba, identity is never fixed. It is performed, translated, always in motion. This makes hybridity not a weakness, but a resource, a space of play, irony, and potential. Critics have argued that Baba's theory is too abstract, too literary, too focused on elite discourse. But its power lies in how it reframes post-colonial life, not as a search for roots, but as a dance across borders. Hybridity refuses the binaries of empire, colonizer and colonized, oppressor and victim, self and other. It shows how power is contaminated by its own performance. And it leaves us with a question that resonates across every migrant, every diaspora, every liminal voice. What if the future is not found in returning to origins, but in learning how to live at the edge of translation? If Baba revealed the cracks in colonial identity, the next reflection steps into a much older tension between power and providence. In the theology of Asharite Islam, politics was not about reason alone, but about the inscrutable will of God. Asharite political theodicy, divine sovereignty, and earthly power. A ruler oppresses. A child starves. A war spreads across once peaceful lands. And the question arises, not just in the streets, but in the soul. Why does God allow injustice to thrive? In the Islamic theological tradition, one school answered with a sharp turn away from human reasoning. The Asharites, emerging in the 9th and 10th centuries, insisted that human reason is too limited to grasp the divine will. What appears unjust to us may still be part of a higher, unknowable order. Their framework became one of the most influential theological responses to the problem of evil, a political theodicy that justified the world as it was by appealing to God's absolute sovereignty. At its core was occasionalism, the belief that God is the only true actor in the universe. Fire does not burn. Gravity does not pull. Humans do not act. Instead, God creates each moment, each cause, each consequence directly. There are no independent causal chains, only divine will, unfolding at every instant. What does this mean for politics? Everything. If a ruler is in power, it is by God's decree. If a calamity strikes, it is not a test of governance. It is the unfolding of divine justice or wisdom beyond comprehension. The Asharites did not encourage tyranny, but they created space for passivity. If all that happens is willed by God, then resistance becomes, at best, a moral dilemma, and at worst, a form of rebellion against divine decree. They emphasize submission not only in worship, but in interpretation. Rationalist schools like the Mutazilites had argued that humans could discern justice through intellect. The Asharites rejected this. Justice, they argued, is not what reason says is right. Justice is what God commands. This view provided theological stability in an unstable world, but it also raised troubling implications. What happens to political accountability when all power is sanctified? What becomes of ethical agency when suffering is reframed as divine necessity? Asharite thought reveals a profound tension, the desire to affirm God's omnipotence and the need to make sense of human suffering. In the space between those two, the moral language of politics bends. And while the Asharite vision rests on submission, the next thinker we encounter, John Stuart Mill, offers a striking counterpoint, the harm principle, where the limits of power are drawn not by heaven but by human freedom itself. Mill's harm principle. How much freedom is too much? A man drinks alone in his home. His neighbors disapprove. A woman writes a controversial opinion. The town murmurs. A young person chooses a path others find strange. And John Stuart Mill, watching from the 19th century, draws a line. That line is the harm principle, the cornerstone of Mill's political philosophy, laid out in his seminal work on liberty. It begins with a simple claim: the only justification for limiting someone's freedom is to prevent harm to others. Not offense, not disapproval, not tradition, only harm. For Mill, liberty was not just a legal right, it was a condition for human flourishing. Individuals must be free to explore, to err, to experiment with life's possibilities, even if others find those choices unwise or offensive. He believed that truth, creativity, and progress depend on this freedom. Without it, society stagnates. People become conformists. Ideas grow dull. But liberty has limits, and the key question becomes, where does one person's freedom end and another's begin? That is where the harm principle enters. If your actions cause direct harm to others, physical violence, fraud, coercion, then the state has a role to intervene. But if your actions merely cause discomfort, disagreement, or challenge to norms, they must be protected. This principle is deceptively simple. In practice, defining harm becomes difficult. Is hate speech harm? Is economic exploitation? Is the erosion of shared values a kind of injury? Mill tried to draw clear boundaries, but the world often blurs them. Still, his vision remains a foundation of liberal thought. He was particularly concerned with what he called the tyranny of the majority, not just government oppression but social pressure. The force that makes people self-censor, hide their differences, and conform out of fear, not law. To counter this, Mill championed not just individual rights, but individuality itself, the courage to think differently, to live strangely, to pursue a life that is fully one's own. In today's world of polarized politics and cultural battles, Mill's harm principle continues to provoke debate. It asks us to weigh freedom against safety, expression against impact, autonomy against responsibility. And it forces us to ask, can a society remain open if it is always afraid of being offended? And how do we draw the line between protection and control? If Mill gave us a moral boundary for liberty, the next thinker, John Rawls, would ask how justice itself might be structured, not for the powerful but for the least advantaged. Rawls' justice as fairness, the veil that reimagined democracy. Picture a society being designed from scratch. No one knows who they'll be, rich or poor, healthy or ill, powerful or powerless. They must decide on rules, rights, and structures before knowing their place in them. This is John Rawls' original position, a thought experiment at the heart of his theory of justice as fairness. In his landmark work, A Theory of Justice, Rawls proposed a new foundation for liberal democracy, grounded not in utility or tradition, but in fairness. He asked, what kind of society would rational people choose if they didn't know their future status within it? To ensure impartiality, he introduced the veil of ignorance, a mental device that strips away knowledge of race, class, gender, talents, and preferences. Behind the veil, no one can game the system in their favor. Decisions made here, Rawls argued, would reflect true fairness. From this original position, he derived two principles of justice. First, equal basic liberties for all, freedom of speech, conscience, thought, and political participation. Second, social and economic inequalities must be arranged to benefit the least advantaged and must be attached to positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. This second principle became known as the difference principle. Rawls accepted that inequality might motivate innovation, but only if those at the bottom gained from the system. Justice, in this view, was not leveling down, but lifting up. His theory was a response to both utilitarianism and libertarianism. Against utilitarianism, he argued that sacrificing some for the happiness of others violates the moral separateness of persons. Against libertarianism, he insisted that justice requires more than non-interference. It requires structural fairness. Rawls did not believe society should guarantee equal outcomes, but he did believe that luck, birth, background, brute circumstance should not determine destiny. His vision inspired generations of thinkers and policymakers, yet it also sparked fierce critique, especially from the next voice in our journey, Robert Nozick, who argued that any redistribution, no matter how well-intentioned, is a violation of individual rights. But before we reach that libertarian challenge, Rawls leaves us with questions that continue to shape modern politics. What would justice look like if we planned society without knowing where we'd land? And can fairness be designed, not just hoped for? Nozick's minimal state, when freedom means leaving others alone. A person builds a business. Another writes a book. Someone inherits land. Another sells their labor. In each case, wealth is earned, exchanged, or given freely. Now imagine a state that steps in, not to protect against theft or fraud, but to take a portion of what was justly acquired and give it to someone else. To Robert Nozick, this is not justice. It is a violation. In his influential book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Nozick launched a direct libertarian challenge to the redistributive vision of John Rawls. He argued that any pattern of wealth distribution, no matter how fair it looks, is unjust if it requires infringing on individual rights. Nozick's central principle is what he called the entitlement theory of justice. In simple terms, it means that wealth or property is justly owned if it came about in the right way, if someone got it fairly in the first place, traded or gave it away fairly, and any past wrongs were properly corrected. If those conditions are met, then however unequal the result may look, it's still fair in Nozick's view. The process matters more than the outcome. If each step is followed fairly, then the resulting distribution, whether equal or wildly unequal, is just. Nozick famously compared taxation for redistribution to forced labor. Taking the fruits of someone's labor, he argued, is morally equivalent to taking part of their life. He rejected pattern theories of justice, like Rawls, because even the most well-designed pattern, once enforced, would constantly need to be reimposed. People have the freedom to give gifts, start businesses, or make choices that upset the balance. To preserve the pattern, the state must interfere endlessly. That, for Nozick, is tyranny. Instead, he championed the minimal state, a government limited to protecting individuals against force, theft, fraud, and enforcing contracts. Anything beyond that, public health care, welfare, subsidies, goes beyond what justice permits. Nozick's vision was bold and provocative. He accepted that it might result in inequality, but he believed that respecting individual rights was more important than achieving equal outcomes. His work helped shape modern libertarianism and redefine debates about the role of the state. But it also raised deep tensions. Can freedom survive in a society where some have vastly more power than others? Is justice really only about transactions, or does it also require outcomes? While Nozick rooted liberty in property and consent, the next thinker, Isaiah Berlin, would offer a more nuanced distinction between two kinds of freedom that define the modern world: negative and positive liberty. Berlin's Two Liberties, the war between freedom from and freedom to. You walk through a quiet city street. No one stops you. You speak freely. Worship or don't. Work where you choose. Vote as you wish. No one interferes. This, for Isaiah Berlin, is freedom in its simplest form. He called it negative liberty, freedom from interference. The ability to live without others stepping in to control you. It's the space around you that the law must not cross. The silence that protects choice. It's not about having power, it's about not being prevented. But Berlin saw another kind of freedom too, more complex, more dangerous. He called it positive liberty, the freedom to be your own master, To live not just free from others, but free from inner chains, ignorance, addiction, fear, irrational desire. At first glance, it sounds noble. Who wouldn't want to be their truest, highest self? Who wouldn't want a life that is not just lived, but chosen? But Berlin warned that positive liberty, when claimed by the state, can become a tool of oppression. Governments may say, "We know what's best for you. We'll restrict your freedom now to make you truly free later." And suddenly, liberty becomes obedience. The state speaks for your true will. Dissent becomes deviance. Control becomes care. Berlin didn't reject positive liberty outright. He acknowledged its appeal. He understood that inner freedom, the kind that comes from reason, self-mastery, clarity, can be deeply meaningful. But he simply insisted that it must never override the negative, that no theory of inner freedom should give others license to dictate your life, especially not in the name of your own supposed good. His essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, became a defining moment in political thought. It exposed how the same word freedom can be used to justify both emancipation and control, and it offered a framework for understanding the battles between liberal democracy and authoritarian power. Not all uses of the word freedom are equal, he warned. Some are masks, some traps. Berlin's voice was cautious, not revolutionary. He didn't offer blueprints, only warnings. But in an age of growing polarization, moral certainty, and sweeping ideologies, his message still resonates. Be wary of those who claim to know what your freedom should look like. Because the louder someone insists they're making you free, the more you should ask free, by whose measure? And if liberty is always at risk of becoming its opposite, how can a democracy preserve it? That question brings us to the next voice, Alexis de Tocqueville, who explored how equality in democratic societies reshapes not just politics, but the soul. Tocqueville's Democratic Equality: Why Liberty Fades When Sameness Spreads. Imagine crossing the Atlantic in the early 19th century. You arrive in a young, restless nation, not yet an empire, but already full of motion. No kings, no aristocracies, no rigid castes, just citizens side by side, equal in theory, eager in spirit. This was the America Alexis de Tocqueville encountered. In his monumental work, Democracy in America, Tocqueville saw more than a new political system. He saw a cultural revolution, a world where birth mattered less than ambition, where social distinctions blurred, where equality wasn't just a policy, it was a mindset. He called it the passion for equality. Not just equality under the law, but the desire to be no less than anyone else. And that desire, he warned, was double-edged. On one hand, it fostered dignity. It gave people a sense of worth. It encouraged participation, enterprise, mobility. It pulled down walls and widened horizons. But on the other hand, it brought new dangers. Tocqueville noticed that as people grew more equal in status, they became more isolated. Family ties weakened. Local associations dissolved. Individuals stood alone before the state, and that solitude made them vulnerable, not just to loneliness, but to soft despotism. He feared a future where the state, in the name of care and efficiency, would become a gentle master, one that protects, provides, and plans, but also flattens, one that asks not for loyalty, just compliance. A government that becomes the parent of its citizens, quietly managing their choices while slowly taking away the habit of self-rule. Yet Tocqueville did not despair. He saw in democratic societies the seeds of self-correction. He praised the American habit of forming associations, town meetings, volunteer groups, civic clubs. These were not just hobbies. They were schools of democracy. They taught citizens how to debate, to compromise, to act. For Tocqueville, democracy thrived not when people looked to the state, but when they looked to each other. He forces us to ask, what does equality cost if it comes at the price of connection? Can a society remain free if its citizens stop practicing freedom together? And as we move deeper into modern governance, Another thinker will weigh freedom and happiness on a different scale. Jeremy Bentham, who believed the goal of power should be clear and calculable, the greatest good for the greatest number. Bentham's utilitarian governance. When morality becomes a math problem, picture a city as a ledger. Every joy and sorrow, every pleasure and pain, tallied and compared. If policies were judged like balance sheets, Jeremy Bentham believed, governments could finally do what they were meant to: maximize happiness. Bentham's philosophy, utilitarianism, sought a simple moral rule: promote the greatest good for the greatest number. It was radical, not because it promised utopia, but because it claimed to be measurable. No divine command, no abstract rights, just results. Pleasure, for Bentham, was good. Pain, bad. Everything else, laws, customs, institutions, was valuable only in how much happiness it produced. He called this the principle of utility, and it became the guiding star for a new kind of governance, one built not on tradition but on calculus. Bentham wanted governments to be more than noble ideals. He wanted them to work. He pushed for prison reform, animal welfare, public education, and more, all with one goal: reduce suffering, increase well-being. But utilitarian governance came with consequences. If happiness is all that matters, then individual rights become negotiable. If sacrificing one person brings joy to many, is it justified? Bentham's critics feared this logic. What protects the few when the many demand comfort? Bentham didn't ignore this. He believed that long-term happiness usually aligns with fairness and liberty, but his system offered no sacred boundaries, only arithmetic. He even designed a model prison, the Panopticon, where inmates could be watched at all times, never sure if the guard's eye was on them. It was efficient, deterrent, and deeply disturbing. Yet his influence spread. His student, John Stuart Mill, would later soften utilitarianism with a deeper respect for liberty. But Bentham laid the groundwork. He made governance something to be optimized. And his voice still echoes in modern debates about policy, cost-benefit analysis, healthcare, climate decisions. How do we weigh the happiness of future generations against today's costs? How do we count what cannot be seen? Bentham forces us to ask, can morality be calculated? And if so, who does the math? The next thinker answered differently. For Immanuel Kant, true morality wasn't about outcomes. It was about principles, about duty, and about a vision of peace, not as convenience, but as a moral obligation, perpetual peace. Kant's perpetual peace. Why universal law matters more than borders. A treaty is signed. The guns go quiet, trade resumes, borders stabilize, diplomats shake hands. But for Immanuel Kant, this isn't peace, it's just a pause between wars. True peace, he argued, must be perpetual, not a temporary ceasefire, but a permanent condition rooted in justice. In his 1795 essay Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, Kant laid out a blueprint for a world where conflict isn't just managed, it's prevented. His proposal wasn't naive. Kant knew war was woven into history, but he believed peace could become possible if certain conditions were met, not through goodwill alone, but through law, structure, and moral obligation. He outlined 6 preliminary articles, rules that nations must follow to even begin the path to peace. These included bans on secret treaties, standing armies, and violent interference in other states. But deeper than these practical steps were his 3 definitive articles. First, every state should be a republic, with separation of powers and rule by law. Kant believed that if people, rather than monarchs, had to vote for war, they would rarely choose it. Second, nations must form a federation of free states, not a single world government, but a voluntary league that respects sovereignty while committing to shared norms. Third, there must be cosmopolitan right, a kind of global hospitality that allows individuals, not just states, to be recognized and protected across borders. For Kant, peace was not just about diplomacy, It was a moral duty. To wage war for gain or glory was a violation of human dignity. To treat other nations as mere means, rather than ends in themselves, was to step outside the bounds of reason. Critics have called his vision too idealistic, and yet Kant anticipated ideas that would shape international law, the United Nations, and the dream of cooperative global order. His ethics reached beyond borders, toward a shared humanity. But Kant also believed peace must be built. It must be enforced by institutions, grounded in constitutions, and guided by reason. And he forces us to ask, is peace the absence of war, or the presence of justice? And if perpetual peace is possible, why does it still feel so far away? As Kant imagined a federation of republics, the next tradition we explore envisioned harmony through a different lens, one not built on contracts between equals, but on the moral order of a cosmic center. From ancient China comes the vision of Tianxia, a world under heaven. Tianxia, Chinese universalism, rule under heaven, not over nations. Tianxia is not just a political theory, it is a cosmology. It imagines the world as a single family, governed by ethical order, not territorial claims. In its classical form, it places the emperor at the center, not because of race or nationalism, but because he is supposed to embody virtue. A ruler in Tianxia earns legitimacy not by strength, but by benevolence. He is the moral heart of the world, guiding others not through force, but through example. The further one is from the center, the looser the ties, but even the most distant lands still fall under the sky. Unlike the Westphalian system, which divides the world into equal sovereign states, Tianxia organizes space relationally. It sees hierarchy not as oppression, but as interdependence. Harmony is not uniformity, but resonance, each part echoing the center in its own way. In modern times, Tianxia has resurfaced in discussions about China's role in global politics. Some interpret it as a soft power vision for a more cooperative world. Others see danger, a veiled call for cultural centrality or dominance. But at its root, Tianxia asks a different question. What if the world is not a battlefield or a marketplace, but a moral community? It challenges the assumption that peace comes from balance of power, or that cooperation must come from competition. Instead, it proposes a model where inclusion depends not on treaties, but on conduct. Critics point out that, historically, Tianxia coexisted with empire, war, and exclusion. Like all grand visions, its reality was far more complicated, and yet its philosophical core remains striking, especially in a fractured multipolar world. Tianxia reminds us that global order is not just about who rules, but how. And it invites a broader reflection. Can a world be held together not by fear or force, but by a shared commitment to virtue? As Tianxia centers harmony and relationship, the next vision we turn to also sees politics as deeply relational, emerging not from rules or force, but from recognition. It comes from southern Africa, and it is called Ubuntu. Ubuntu as political ethos. Identity built on relationship, not individual. A stranger stumbles in your village. You offer food, not because they paid, but because they arrived. A child makes a mistake, and the community gathers, not to punish, but to remind them who they are. In every gesture, a deeper principle hums beneath. I am because we are. This is Ubuntu, a Southern African worldview that sees identity as relational, dignity as shared, and politics as something more than power. It is an ethic of interconnectedness, a philosophy of community, and a radical invitation to reimagine what it means to be human together. In Ubuntu, the individual is never isolated. You exist through others. Your freedom, your value, your being, all emerge in relationship. It's not that the self disappears, but that it is shaped through recognition, compassion, and participation. Applied to politics, Ubuntu shifts everything. Justice is not merely about rules, it's about restoration. Authority is not about domination, it's about stewardship. Leadership is not about commanding from above, but about listening, mediating, and affirming the bonds that hold a community together. Ubuntu has influenced post-apartheid South Africa's reconciliation efforts, especially through leaders like Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't seek revenge. It sought healing. It asked not just what was broken, but how wholeness could be restored. This ethos is not soft. It requires courage to forgive, to acknowledge, to share power. It demands accountability, but in service of unity, not division. Critics argue that Ubuntu can be vague or difficult to apply in modern legal systems. But perhaps that is its power. It resists reduction. It insists that law alone cannot make us whole, that policies without humanity will always fall short. In a world where politics often rewards isolation, polarization, and profit, Ubuntu offers a different center. What if leadership began with empathy? What if justice meant restoring relationships? What if freedom was not the absence of others, but the fullness of being with them? Ubuntu invites us to see not just what a society enforces, but what it affirms. And it leads us into the next vision, a political principle from Islamic tradition that also places dignity in dialogue, shura, consultation before command. Shura, Islamic consultation, deliberation before decree. Picture a circle. Elders, scholars, leaders, gathered not in rigid rank, but in shared counsel. At the center is not a throne, but a question: what is just? What serves the people? What honors God? This is shura, the Islamic principle of consultation, rooted in the Quran and practiced since the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Shura isn't a parliamentary system. It's not bound by modern electoral rules or political parties, but it is a profound commitment to dialogue, to hearing the voices of others before making decisions, to recognizing that authority, in its truest form, does not ignore the community. It reflects it. It listens before it speaks. It weighs before it rules. The Quran praises those who conduct their affairs by mutual consultation, and while interpretations vary, the core message is clear. Leadership must listen. Power must pause. Shura represents not weakness, but ethical discipline, the strength to lead by hearing first. In early Islamic history, shura was not just symbolic. The first caliphs were chosen through discussion and agreement among prominent members of the community. Decisions on matters of law, war, and social order were debated, not dictated. It was a culture of discourse grounded in trust, memory, and shared moral responsibility. This principle stood as a safeguard against tyranny, a reminder that even divinely guided leadership should remain rooted in humility and accountability. No human authority is absolute, only God's wisdom is perfect, and therefore those who lead must be open to the voices of those they serve. Over time, the practice of shura evolved. In some eras and empires, it was formalized into councils. In others, it faded into ceremony. Today, Muslim thinkers continue to debate its role, how to balance tradition with democratic structures, how to ensure that consultation includes not just elites, but all voices, including women and the marginalized, how to preserve shura's essence while adapting its form. Yet shura remains a living idea. It challenges authoritarianism. It affirms the value of reasoned deliberation, and it insists that governance is not simply about decrees, but about listening, understanding, and honoring collective wisdom. It raises questions that echo far beyond any one culture. Can obedience coexist with participation? Can spiritual authority invite open debate? And what kind of strength comes not from ruling alone, but from choosing to ask first? In a time of loud proclamations and silent citizens, shura reminds us of a different rhythm, one where silence precedes speech, and listening is the first act of leadership. As shura centers wisdom in shared voice, the next thinker we meet, Max Weber, saw modern authority evolving in a different direction into systems of order so rational, so structured, they would change not just politics, but the very shape of power. Welcome to Bureaucratic Authority. Weber's Bureaucratic Authority. Why charisma always gives way to forms. You enter an office. The walls are blank. The tone is formal, and every decision moves through a channel. There are forms, procedures, protocols, no favors, no family ties, just rules. This, to Max Weber, was not a nightmare. It was modernity. Weber saw bureaucracy not as a flaw of modern governance, but as its defining feature. In traditional societies, authority came from charisma or inheritance. Kings ruled by bloodline, prophets by inspiration, tribal chiefs by custom. But in the modern state, something else had taken hold: rational legal authority. In this system, power is tied not to personality, but to position. Orders are obeyed not because of who gives them, but because they are issued according to legitimate procedures. The individual disappears. The office remains. Bureaucracy, Weber argued, is built on 6 principles: a clear hierarchy, specialization of tasks, a system of rules, technical competence, written documentation, and impersonality. These qualities, he believed, made bureaucratic systems incredibly efficient and also deeply inhuman. In the bureaucracy, no one is special. No one is exempt. There is no space for intuition, for personal judgment, for improvisation. Everything is standardized. Everything moves through the machine. And that, Weber warned, is both its power and its danger. He called it the iron cage of modernity. A world where reason has become routine, where rules replace values, where efficiency swallows meaning. Bureaucracy delivers order, but at the cost of spirit. Weber didn't reject bureaucracy entirely. He knew that large societies need systems to function, that hospitals, courts, armies, and governments cannot run on charisma alone. But he worried about what gets lost when structure becomes the highest virtue. In his time, and even more so in ours, Weber's vision feels eerily familiar. Algorithms sort us, institutions numb us, and power hides behind paperwork. He forces us to ask, can a system built to be fair remain truly human? What happens to morality when obedience to procedure becomes the only rule? And when we build machines to run society, do we risk becoming parts of the machine ourselves? If Weber saw order in the cold logic of rule, the next political philosophy we visit takes that logic even further. From ancient China, legalism, as envisioned by Han Fizi, offered a vision of control that left no room for virtue at all. Han Fizi and legalism, control not through virtue, but through fear. Imagine a state with no interest in virtue, no concern for intentions, no room for mercy, only laws, strict, clear, and absolute. This was the vision of Han Fizi, one of the sharpest and most unforgiving thinkers in ancient China. While Confucians taught that good government starts with good character, Han Fizi believed such thinking was naive. Morality, he argued, is unpredictable. Human nature is selfish, and relying on rulers to be virtuous is dangerous. Instead, he proposed a system where laws, not ethics, shape behavior, where the ruler governs not by persuasion, but by control. Legalism was not about fairness. It was about stability. Order was the highest good. Harmony was enforced, not nurtured. Rewards and punishments were calibrated to guide conduct precisely, like weights balancing a scale. Han Fizi believed that people respond to incentives, not ideals. If the law is strict and consistent, people will obey. If rewards are generous and punishments harsh, behavior becomes predictable. In this system, even a mediocre ruler could govern well, because the system itself, not personal wisdom, maintained order. The ruler, in legalism, is deliberately distant, mysterious, emotionless. He does not seek to be loved or even admired, only obeyed. Secrecy is power. Trust is a liability, and leniency is a threat to the state. Legalism helped unify China under the Qin dynasty. Massive projects were built. Rebellion was crushed. The empire grew, but it also burned bright and short. The same rigidity that made it powerful also made it brittle. Today, Mouffel's ideas are controversial. Some see echoes of legalism in modern surveillance states, where behavior is tracked and controlled not through virtue but through systems and consequences. Others see it as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when law forgets the people it governs. And yet, legalism remains one of the clearest expressions of realpolitik in history. It doesn't ask how the world should work, it tells you how it does. Mouffe forces us to ask, can you build a just society without appealing to justice? Can you govern humans as if they were machines and still call it governance? And if laws can shape order so completely, what happens when law itself becomes untouchable? As legalism stripped governance of virtue, modern Confucian thinkers have taken a different path, reviving ancient ethics to justify a new kind of authoritarianism. Confucian authoritarianism, order as moral obedience. Picture a state that speaks with the voice of a father. It doesn't ask for votes. It asks for respect. It doesn't promise freedom. It promises harmony. In this vision, the citizen is not a client, but a child. The ruler is not a servant, but a sage. And the goal is not individual liberty, but moral order. This is modern Confucian authoritarianism. Confucianism has long emphasized hierarchy, duty, and virtue. In classical times, it imagined rulers as moral exemplars, leaders who govern not by fear or law alone, but by embodying righteousness. A well-ordered society began with a well-ordered self. Politics was an extension of ethics. But in the modern era, some thinkers and states have reinterpreted this tradition. They ask, what if Confucian values, like respect for elders, deference to authority, and the primacy of the family, could form the foundation of a strong, centralized government? One that rejects Western liberalism not by force, but by cultural alternative. In this framework, democracy is seen as disorder. Rights without responsibility lead to chaos. Individualism corrodes unity. Instead of competitive politics, you get consensus. Instead of checks and balances, you get social roles. Education is key, not just for skills, but for shaping character. Citizens are taught to follow, not just to question. The state becomes the moral educator, guiding people toward virtue whether they seek it or not. Modern Confucian authoritarianism isn't anti-modern. It uses technology, builds infrastructure, grows economies, but it frames its authority in cultural terms. It claims continuity with tradition. It wears the mask of wisdom. Critics argue that it uses Confucianism to justify censorship, conformity, and centralized control. That it co-opts ancient texts to silence modern dissent. That it honors ritual while abandoning justice. But supporters say it offers an alternative to liberal democracy, one rooted not in rights, but in roles, not in contracts, but in care. It raises difficult questions. Is freedom the highest political value? Can a state truly be paternal without becoming paternalistic? And does cultural identity justify curbing dissent if it promises order? As modern Confucianism reaches backward to justify control, the next thinker we visit looked forward and upward. For Hegel, the state was not just an institution, it was the unfolding of spirit itself. Hegel's state as spirit, when the nation becomes divine. Imagine a mind so vast it contains all of history, a consciousness that stretches across time, not just observing, but becoming. For Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, this was not a god or a king, it was the state. To Hegel, the state was not merely a government or a legal structure. It was the embodiment of what he called Geist, spirit, or world reason unfolding through history. It was where freedom became real, not just imagined, where the individual found purpose, not in isolation, but in belonging to something larger, higher, and enduring. He believed history moved through a dialectical process. Thesis meets antithesis, and out of their clash emerges synthesis, a higher form. Monarchies give way to republics. Despotism collides with liberty. Each conflict, each revolution is not random. It's a necessary moment in the evolution of freedom. And where does this journey lead? To the rational state. For Hegel, the rational state isn't about majority rule or popular will. It's not democracy as we typically imagine it. It's a state guided by reason, where laws reflect universal principles, not personal whims. It's where the individual and the collective are no longer at odds, but united in a higher ethical life. The family, the civil society, the state, each plays a role in this unfolding. The state at the top is not a tool. It's a moral organism, an expression of freedom actualized through law, duty, and shared identity. Hegel wrote in the shadow of the French Revolution. He admired its ideals, but feared its chaos. Freedom, he argued, cannot be imposed overnight. It must develop, gradually, through institutions, through discipline, not mere desire. Critics have long wrestled with his vision. Some see in Hegel the seed of authoritarianism, the idea that the state is sacred, its commands justified by history. Others find in him the most profound defender of political community, a thinker who saw liberty not as escape, but as structure. His ideas influenced Marx, who took the dialectic and turned it material. They shaped nationalist thinkers who saw the nation-state as the culmination of spirit, and they haunt modern debates about sovereignty, progress, and identity. Hegel forces us to ask, can freedom be real without belonging? Can the state elevate the individual, or only consume them? And if history has a direction, what happens to those who refuse to follow? As Hegel envisioned a future shaped by reason and unity, the next thinker, Samuel Huntington, saw something else, a world not converging but fragmenting. A future where civilizations, not ideologies, would define the lines of conflict. A future shaped not by synthesis, but by clash. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations: Why Culture Wars Are Geopolitical. The Cold War ends, the ideological lines dissolve, capitalism spreads, democracies rise, and many predict a new global harmony. But in 1993, political scientist Samuel Huntington offers a different vision, one not of convergence, but of conflict. In his provocative essay and later book, The Clash of Civilizations, Huntington argues that the future of global politics will not be shaped by economics or ideology, but by culture, and not just any culture. Civilizational culture. He divides the world into broad civilizational zones: Western, Islamic, Cynic, Hindu, Orthodox, African, Latin American. These are not nations or alliances, but deep cultural roots formed by language, history, religion, and memory. They shape how societies understand power, justice, identity, and each other. In the post-Cold War world, Huntington believed these civilizational differences would become the primary source of conflict. Not because of misunderstanding, but because of fundamental incompatibilities. Where one sees freedom, another sees blasphemy. Where one values individualism, another honors hierarchy. These aren't just disagreements, they're different worlds. He pointed to fault lines, places where civilizations meet, as zones of particular tension: the Islamic world and the West, China and its neighbors, Orthodox Russia and Western Europe. In these regions, he warned, friction was not only likely, it was inevitable. Huntington's theory was controversial from the start. Critics accused him of essentializing cultures, reducing diverse societies to monolithic blocks. Others feared his ideas would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people believe in a clash, they may act to provoke one. But his predictions gained traction, especially after 9/11. Many saw his framework as prescient, a chilling map of the post-Cold War order. Others saw it as a lens that blinded more than it revealed, failing to account for internal divisions, global cooperation, and the power of shared values. Huntington didn't call for conflict, but he believed ignoring cultural difference was dangerous. He challenged the Western assumption that liberal democracy was the endpoint of history. He insisted that other civilizations had their own values, and they would not simply dissolve into the global order. He forces us to ask, what binds a people together and what tears them apart? Can civilizations learn to coexist, or will difference always demand defense? And if global peace depends on cultural humility, are we capable of it? If Huntington saw conflict in cultural identity, the next thinker, Mahatma Gandhi, offered a radically different path, one where truth and resistance could walk hand in hand, not through violence, but through satyagraha, the force of soul. Gandhi's satyagraha, political power through radical nonviolence. A man walks toward armed police. He carries no weapon. He does not shout. He does not strike. He simply steps forward again and again as they beat him to the ground. Then someone else steps in to take his place, and another, and another. This was not submission. This was satyagraha, a force more powerful than violence, according to Mahatma Gandhi. Satyagraha, often translated as truth force or soul force, was Gandhi's method of political resistance. But it was more than a tactic. It was a philosophy, a way of being, a moral discipline that refused to separate means from ends. To Gandhi, true resistance must be rooted in satya, which means truth and love, not hatred, not vengeance. Violence, he argued, only breeds more violence. Even if you defeat your enemy, you've corrupted your soul. But satyagraha allows the resistor to fight without losing what matters most, their humanity. Unlike passive resistance, satyagraha is active. It demands courage. It seeks not to defeat the opponent, but to convert them, to awaken their conscience, to hold up a mirror so clearly that the injustice of their actions becomes undeniable, not through argument, but through example. Gandhi developed this method while living in South Africa, resisting laws that discriminated against Indians. Later, in India, he would wield it against British colonial rule. Boycotts, marches, hunger strikes, each carefully chosen, disciplined, and principled. He called for ahimsa, non-violence, not just in action, but in thought. Satyagraha was not a strategy to win political points. It was a spiritual struggle. The resistor had to purify themselves, embrace suffering, and reject hatred in all forms. The goal was not just independence, it was Swaraj, self-rule. Not only from Britain, but over the ego, over anger, over fear. Gandhi believed a free society could not be built by violent men. It had to be rooted in ethics. Critics said it was naive, slow, even manipulative. Others pointed to moments when nonviolence cracked, when movements splintered, when power did not yield. But Gandhi remained firm. The means must reflect the ends. You cannot build justice with injustice. Satyagraha inspired civil rights leaders around the world, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Václav Havel. It planted the idea that resistance could be moral, even sacred. And it leaves us with enduring questions. Can truth alone move history? Can love disarm power? And what happens when the strongest weapon is refusing to use one? As Gandhi turned resistance into a moral calling, the next thinker, Baruch Spinoza, wrote in a different language, in a different century, but he too believed that politics must begin with truth. His theological-political treatise would challenge the very foundations of religious authority and argue for reason, freedom, and the state's role in protecting both. Spinoza's theological-political treatise, When Freedom Demands State Secrecy. In 17th-century Europe, to question the church was to risk everything. To write about God with reason, instead of revelation, was heresy. And yet, in the shadows of persecution, Baruch Spinoza picked up his pen and did exactly that. His theological-political treatise, published anonymously in 1670, was not just a bold work of philosophy, it was a political firebomb. Spinoza believed that religion and politics must be separated, not to diminish faith, but to preserve freedom. He saw how sacred authority could become a mask for tyranny, how theology could silence dissent, shape laws, and punish thought. And he argued that when rulers use divine will to justify power, both religion and reason suffer. His central claim was radical for its time. The state must guarantee freedom of thought, not as a luxury, but as a necessity for a stable, just society. Without freedom to question, to doubt, to interpret, truth itself withers. Spinoza did not reject religion. He believed in God, not as a personal being, but as nature itself, infinite and necessary. His God was not a ruler, but a system, not a judge, but the very logic of existence. This view unsettled theologians who saw in Spinoza a dangerous blurring of sacred and secular. But his real offense was political. Spinoza argued that Scripture must be read historically, critically, not as a set of divine commands, but as a human document shaped by time, culture, and power. Prophets were not infallible. They were interpreters, responding to their era. Religious law, he insisted, had no place in civil governance. He believed the sovereign should have full authority over public affairs, not priests, not prophets. The role of religion was moral guidance, not political control. Yet Spinoza's theory of sovereignty was not authoritarian. The ruler must protect freedom, must allow debate, must tolerate diversity of belief. The power of the state was justified only if it preserved the freedom of the mind. This wasn't idealism, it was realism. Spinoza saw that forced belief leads only to hypocrisy, that fear of punishment creates submission, not conviction, that a thinking citizen is not a threat, but the foundation of peace. His treatise was banned. He was denounced as an atheist, even though he spoke of God constantly. But over time, his ideas would influence Enlightenment thinkers, secular constitutions, and modern liberalism. Spinoza asks us to consider, can faith survive freedom? Can a society built on reason still honor the sacred? And if the truth is powerful, why must it ever be protected by force? As Spinoza defended the liberty of the individual mind, Alexis de Tocqueville would offer a different warning about what happens when liberty becomes tyranny, not from above, but from the majority. Tyranny of the majority. When democracy eats itself. You walk through a free country. There are elections, courts, newspapers, no kings, no chains. Yet something feels off. People speak in hushed tones. Dissenters are mocked, not imprisoned, but exiled in spirit. The law protects them, but the crowd condemns them. This was Alexis de Tocqueville's warning that in a democracy, tyranny may not come from a monarch, it may come from us. In his 1835 work, Democracy in America, Tocqueville praised the vitality of democratic life in the United States. He admired its civic institutions, its local governance, its culture of equality, but he also saw a new kind of threat, not from the state, but from public opinion. He called it the tyranny of the majority. In aristocracies, tyranny is visible. It wears a crown, but in democracies, it wears a smile. It speaks in the voice of the people. It silences not through censorship, but through shame. It marginalizes not by force, but by consensus. Tocqueville saw how a strong majority could impose its will on minorities, not just in law, but in thought, how it could create conformity, discourage debate, and punish difference, not officially, but socially. He feared a world where everyone was free to think, but few dared to think differently. The majority, he noted, has immense moral power in democratic societies. It sets the tone, defines what is respectable, and makes the boundaries of what can be said. And because it speaks in the name of freedom, its pressure can be invisible, yet deeply felt. Tocqueville wasn't arguing against democracy. He believed it was the future, but he urged vigilance. He stressed the need for institutions that protect minority rights, independent courts, strong local governance, freedom of the press, and above all, a culture of pluralism. Without these, even a democratic society could become intellectually closed, emotionally uniform, spiritually narrow. He forces us to ask, what happens when fear of disapproval becomes stronger than love of truth? Can a society be politically free, yet psychologically captive? And who protects the thinker when the crowd becomes the king? As Tocqueville warned of the weight of consensus, the next thinker, Simone Weil, took the critique further. For her, the true enemy of the soul was not just the majority, it was force itself. Visible or invisible, physical or moral. She called for a politics rooted not in strength, but in grace. A radical rejection of domination in all its forms. Simone Weil's rejection of force, why real power doesn't coerce. Imagine a hand raised, not to strike, but to shield, not out of fear, but of reverence. Simone Weil lived in a century that worshipped force through wars, revolutions, and ideologies, and she refused to bow. A French philosopher, mystic and activist, Weil, saw something others did not. She saw that force does more than kill. It deforms the soul. It turns both the victim and the wielder into things, objects. Force, she wrote, turns a person into a thing the moment it is applied. In her 1940 essay, The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, Weil read Homer's epic not as a tale of glory, but as a meditation on dehumanization. The hero becomes a beast. The victor becomes numb. The gods are silent. Everyone is crushed under the same brutal weight. For Weil, force was not just physical violence. It was any compulsion that robs a person of dignity. Any system that reduces humans to tools, bodies, or abstractions. War, labor exploitation, oppressive institutions, even certain kinds of political rhetoric. She had no patience for utopian dreams built on sacrifice. No revolution, she believed, could justify turning people into means. No cause, however righteous, could excuse the destruction of another's soul. Her politics were strange, even to her contemporaries. She supported the oppressed, but rejected ideologies. She believed in justice, but feared the machinery of justice becoming another engine of force. Even pacifism, she warned, could become a weapon if it turned into self-righteousness. Weil proposed a different path, attention, a quiet, almost sacred form of listening. To truly see the other as they are without trying to use, fix, or control them. She called this decreation, the letting go of ego, of domination, of the need to win. For Weil, the most urgent political question was not who should rule, but how can we live without turning others into objects? She worked in factories, joined the resistance, and lived in voluntary poverty. Her life was a kind of protest against spectacle, against pride, against power. She forces us to ask, can politics be built on compassion rather than control? Can justice emerge without conquest? And is it possible to live in a world of force without becoming part of it? While Weil tried to strip politics of force, the next thinker we encounter, Carl Schmitt, went in the opposite direction. For him, politics was defined by conflict, and the sovereign was not the peacemaker, but the one who decided in the exception. Carl Schmitt's decisionism. Sovereign is he who decides the exception. In moments of crisis, when the Constitution cracks and the rules are silent, someone must decide. Not deliberate, not vote. Decide. For Carl Schmitt, that moment is the essence of politics. Schmitt, a German legal theorist writing in the early 20th century, rejected the liberal dream of politics as endless negotiation. He saw law not as a fixed system, but as something sustained by power, and power ultimately rests on a person, not a principle. His most famous claim, sovereign is he who decides on the exception. What does this mean? It means the true political leader is not the one who manages ordinary life. It's the one who decides when normal rules no longer apply. Who suspends the law in the name of order? Who defines the friend and the enemy? Who brings clarity to chaos by drawing a line? In Schmitt's view, liberal democracy hides from this reality. It believes that politics can be neutral, that law can be impartial, that the state can be procedural. But when conflict arises, when war looms or society fractures, someone must take responsibility. Someone must choose. This act of decision is not about consensus. It's about existential affirmation, about saying, this is who we are, and this is who we are not. Every political community, Schmitt argued, is built on exclusion. There is no we without a them. This philosophy attracted strong reactions. Schmitt was brilliant, dangerous, and deeply influential. He joined the Nazi Party, a fact that has haunted his legacy. Yet his ideas continue to shape modern political theory, especially debates about executive power, constitutional crises, and the limits of liberalism. His critics argue that Schmitt's focus on decision opens the door to dictatorship, that by placing so much weight on the sovereign, he undermines the rule of law. Others say he merely described what liberalism refuses to admit, that all politics contains violence, all order rests on power. In an age of populist leaders and emergency declarations, Schmitt feels eerily relevant. When norms break, when the system falters, who decides, and what justifies their decision? Schmitt forces us to ask, can politics ever escape the need for authority? Is a rule of law possible without someone above it? And in the end, is legitimacy found in reason or in the one who acts? As Schmitt tied sovereignty to the will to decide, the next thinker, Friedrich Nietzsche, offered a deeper, more primal force behind all politics. Not law, not duty, but the will to power. Nietzsche's will to power, the death of truth in modern power. Beneath laws and institutions, beneath morals and ideologies, Friedrich Nietzsche saw something raw and electric, the will to power. This was not just a thirst for control or conquest, it was deeper. It was life's own impulse to expand, to shape, to express. For Nietzsche, everything nature, art, religion, philosophy was animated by this driving force, and politics was no exception. Nietzsche did not trust political systems that claimed to be neutral or moral. He saw them as masks, as products of dominant wills disguised as universal truths. Justice, often just the weapon of the strong. Equality, a tool of the weak to restrain greatness. He believed that behind every claim to fairness, every appeal to reason, there lurked a contest of forces, competing visions, clashing values. Politics, then, was not about compromise. It was about creation, about who gets to define meaning, who gets to say what counts as good, noble, or true. Nietzsche's philosophy is often misunderstood as brutal or cynical, but he wasn't simply praising the strong or the ruthless. He was critiquing the cowardice of systems that fear boldness, that flatten difference, that make life small in the name of order. He longed for higher types, individuals who would not submit to herd morality, creators of value, artists of life. In politics, this meant rejecting conformity and embracing the hard task of shaping the world as a work of will. But Nietzsche's will to power is not just a theory of elites, it's also a warning. When denied, suppressed, or distorted, this force doesn't disappear. It festers. It returns in twisted forms: resentment, fanaticism, nihilism. He saw in modern democracies a danger, not too much power but too little spirit, too much leveling, and not enough rising. He challenged both the complacency of liberalism and the violence of authoritarianism. What he wanted was not obedience or control, but transformation. Politics not as administration, but as existential drama. And so he asks, are we ruled by the noble or by the timid? Is our politics a space for creativity or only for management? And what happens to a culture when its deepest drives are hidden behind polite slogans? Nietzsche's vision is haunting, energizing, and unresolved. He didn't give us a system. He gave us a mirror and dared us to look. As Nietzsche exposed the forces beneath ideology, the next thinker, Jean Baudrillard, peered into the fog above it. In a world of screens, simulations, and spectacle, he wondered what happens when politics is no longer about truth at all. Welcome to Post-Truth. Baudrillard's post-truth politics. When simulation replaces reality, the camera pans, the candidate smiles, the crowd cheers on cue. The words are polished, the outrage rehearsed, the image flawless. But behind the glow of screens, something has shifted. Politics is no longer a contest of ideas. It's a war of appearances. Jean Baudrillard saw this coming. A French philosopher and cultural theorist, Baudrillard argued that modern society was moving beyond reality into a world of simulacra, signs that no longer point to anything real, images that float free from meaning. In this world, representation replaces truth, and nowhere is this more visible than in politics. He believed that the media didn't reflect reality, it produced it. News, advertising, entertainment, they blended into a hyper-reality where the line between fact and fiction evaporated. The politician becomes a brand. The speech becomes content. The policy becomes a performance. In this post-truth world, truth isn't what happened. It's what trends. The winner isn't the one who's right, but the one who controls the narrative. Scandal, sincerity, outrage, even failure, they can all be spun, monetized, memed. Baudrillard warned that when simulation becomes total, we lose the ability to distinguish between the map and the territory. Politics becomes a game of signs without substance. Elections are rituals. Debates are theater. Consent is manufactured. This doesn't mean people are fooled. Often they know the show is fake, but the spectacle is too vast, too fast, too fragmented to resist. We scroll, we comment, we vote, and nothing feels real. The danger, Baudrillard suggested, is not deception. It's indifference. When everything is spin, nothing matters. When lies and truth look the same, cynicism replaces conviction. The very idea of reality becomes suspect. He forces us to ask, what is truth in a world of infinite signs? Is politics still about action, or only reaction? And if everything is a simulation, where does resistance begin? Baudrillard offered no easy answers. He didn't call for a return to truth, but a reckoning with its disappearance. A deeper awareness of how media, language, and symbols shape what we call real. But not all thinkers surrendered to spectacle. The next one, Jürgen Habermas, believed that through dialogue, reason, and mutual understanding, democracy could still be real. His vision, deliberative democracy, a politics not of image, but of shared meaning. Habermas's deliberative democracy, politics by reason, not rhetoric. In an age of spin, polarization, and digital noise, it's easy to believe that politics has become hopeless. But Jürgen Habermas still believes in conversation. Not the shouting kind, not debate for dominance, but something deeper, a kind of speaking where truth matters, where people come together not just to win, but to understand. This is the core of deliberative democracy, a vision where legitimacy is earned not through power or performance, but through reasoned agreement, where laws are justified not by tradition or authority, but because citizens, engaging as equals, have had the chance to deliberate on them. Habermas began his work in post-war Germany, trying to understand how societies recover from authoritarianism. What kind of democracy can resist domination? What kind of public discourse allows for genuine participation, especially after trust has been shattered? He turned to what he called the public sphere, a space where people discuss matters of common concern. In its ideal form, this space is open, inclusive, and free from coercion. It's where arguments are tested, perspectives are shared, and policies are shaped by collective reasoning rather than private interest. For Habermas, communication is not just transmission, it's the foundation of democracy. He distinguishes between strategic communication, where language is used to manipulate or control, and communicative action, where the goal is mutual understanding. Only the latter, he argues, leads to legitimacy. But deliberative democracy isn't naive. It doesn't assume that people will always agree. It doesn't demand utopia. It asks that we take the process seriously, that we speak honestly, listen respectfully, and justify our claims in ways others can understand. Critics say this vision is too idealistic, that in real life, power skews conversation, that not everyone has equal time, language, or confidence to speak. Habermas acknowledges this. He emphasizes the importance of institutions that protect speech, amplify marginalized voices, and enforce fairness. In our fragmented age of comment wars, algorithmic bubbles, and political fatigue, Habermas invites us to slow down, to imagine politics not as a war of words, but as a search for shared meaning. He asks, can we speak with one another, not just past each other? Can reason still matter when truth feels optional? And what does democracy become when we stop believing in the power of conversation? As Habermas calls us to rebuild democracy through dialogue, the next perspective insists that not all voices are heard equally, that where you stand, your body, your history, your experience, shapes what you see. From this view emerges feminist standpoint theory. Feminist standpoint theory, whose perspective becomes the law. Imagine standing at the margins. You see what those in the center cannot. You feel the pressure of systems that others mistake for fairness. You speak, and the room quiets, not to listen, but to question your right to speak at all. From this tension, a theory begins to take shape. Feminist standpoint theory is more than a critique. It's a reorientation of knowledge itself. It begins with a radical claim. Objectivity is not found from nowhere. It is shaped by where you stand. Your social position, your lived experience, your access to power, all influence what you can see, what you can know, and what you are allowed to say. Developed in the late 20th century by thinkers like Nancy Hartsock, Sandra Harding, and Patricia Hill Collins, standpoint theory argues that marginalized perspectives are not distortions of truth, they are windows into it. The view from below is not inferior. It is often clearer, sharper, more honest about the world as it is. Hartsock rooted the theory in Marxism, comparing women's experiences in a patriarchal society to the worker's experience in capitalism. Just as the laborer sees the contradictions of economic life more vividly than the capitalist, so too do women, people of color, and other marginalized groups perceive the contours of injustice more clearly than those who benefit from it. But this isn't just identity politics. Standpoint theory doesn't say that all experiences are equally valid, or that truth is merely subjective. It says that some standpoints, because of the structural conditions they reveal, offer critical insight, especially when they are formed not in isolation, but in struggle, in solidarity, in reflection. Patricia Hill Collins extended the theory with Black feminist thought, showing how race, gender, and class intersect to shape both oppression and understanding. She argued that Black women's experiences, long silenced or distorted, offer a powerful standpoint from which to critique dominant narratives. Feminist standpoint theory calls for a restructuring of knowledge, not just adding new voices, but rethinking who gets to define what counts as knowledge in the first place. It challenges the false neutrality of traditional epistemology. It demands that we look at who is asking the questions and who is never even in the room. It forces us to ask, what do we miss when only the powerful define the truth? Can justice begin without first changing where we listen? And if knowledge is always situated, where should we choose to stand? As feminist standpoint theory urges us to center the overlooked and the excluded, the next thinker, Arendt, asks us to look even further outward, beyond the human, beyond society, to a planet in crisis. His vision, eco-politics rooted in deep ecology. Arendt's eco-politics, power that includes the non-human, The forest is not just a resource. The mountain is not just scenery. The river is not just a pipeline. Arnas stood among these things, not as their owner, but as their kin, and from this reverence he gave birth to a philosophy that pushed politics beyond the human deep ecology. Næss, a Norwegian philosopher and mountaineer, coined the term in the 1970s to distinguish between shallow and deep approaches to environmentalism. The shallow approach, he said, aimed to preserve nature for human benefit, clean air, stable climate, sustainable growth. The deep approach asked a more radical question: does nature have value beyond what it offers us? Deep ecology begins with a premise: all living beings have intrinsic worth, not because they are useful, beautiful, or endangered, but because they exist. From the smallest lichen to the vastest ocean, all forms of life have equal right to flourish. This shift in perspective demands a different politics. Næss called for a fundamental rethinking of human society, not just better laws or greener technology, but a change in worldview. He challenged anthropocentrism, the idea that humans are the center of existence. He advocated biospheric egalitarianism, where no species is above another in moral rank. For Næss, environmental crisis was not just about emissions or plastic. It was about arrogance, about the belief that we could dominate, extract, and engineer our way through nature without consequence. His eco-politics emphasized simplicity, decentralization, and self-restraint. He admired communities that lived with the land, not against it. He urged the development of ecosophy, a personal philosophy of ecological harmony shaped by local conditions, cultural traditions, and spiritual awareness. Critics called it unrealistic, too romantic, too radical. But Næss insisted that without radical change, survival itself was at stake. And he knew that systems built on domination of nature, of others, ultimately collapse. He forces us to ask, what is a good life if it destroys other lives? Can justice include the more than human world? And if politics begins with values, whose voices have we never heard because they don't speak? As Næss expands politics to include the silent rhythms of the earth, the next tradition turns back to ancient tensions between faith and power, divine law and human rule. It asks what happens when theology enters the political sphere, and how does belief shape sovereignty? Enter political theology. Political theology. When secular states inherit divine logic, imagine a law that claims divine authority, a constitution built not just on reason, but revelation. A leader who does not simply represent the people, but claims to speak for the eternal. This is the realm of political theology, where questions of sovereignty, power, and legitimacy collide with questions of God. In ancient times, religion and politics were rarely separate. Kings ruled by divine right. Laws were handed down from the heavens. To disobey the ruler was to defy the gods. But with the rise of modern secular states, that fusion was meant to dissolve. And yet, it never truly vanished. In the 20th century, thinkers like Carl Schmitt revived the idea of political theology, not as a return to theocracy, but as a way of understanding how secular politics still echoes religious forms. Schmitt argued that all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. Sovereignty, he said, mirrors the God who can suspend natural law. The exception, the moment when rules break down, is a modern miracle. Political theology isn't just about religion, it's about how ultimate authority is framed, how legitimacy is sanctified, how power justifies itself by appealing to something beyond debate. In modern political movements, we see it in nationalist ideologies that sacralize the homeland, in revolutionary rhetoric that treats the people's will as sacred, in legal systems that invoke natural law or divine justice. In the post-9/11 world, political theology re-entered the global stage. Debates over Islamic governance, Christian nationalism, and the role of religious values in secular democracies all reflect the persistence of sacred political entanglement. Thinkers like Giorgio Agamben have taken political theology further, exploring how states of emergency, border regimes, and biopolitics echo religious ideas of sacrifice, purity, and exclusion. Even the bare life of the human body, he suggests, becomes a theological category under sovereign power. Political theology forces us to ask, is any authority ever truly secular? What happens when politics seeks redemption, or when religion seeks rule? And can freedom survive if power wraps itself in the language of the sacred? Whether through divine law, charismatic prophecy, or secular myth, political theology reminds us that modern power often borrows ancient robes. And as it explores how transcendence shapes rule, the next theory turns to something colder, sharper, and far more material: the market. What if the highest value isn't virtue or salvation, but efficiency? Enter neoliberalism as philosophy. Neoliberalism as philosophy: freedom through markets, control through debt. There is no alternative. That was the slogan often echoed in the late 20th century as markets were unleashed, public goods privatized, and state responsibilities outsourced. But neoliberalism is more than a set of economic policies. It's a worldview, a philosophy, one that redefines what it means to be human and what it means to be free. Neoliberalism, in its pure form, argues that the market is not just an efficient tool, it is the best way to organize society. Competition isn't a flaw to be corrected. It's a virtue to be extended. Education, healthcare, even the self, everything becomes a potential market. The roots of neoliberal thought stretch back to thinkers like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, who warned against centralized planning and saw the free market as the only safeguard of individual liberty. But as their ideas spread into policy, through Thatcher, Reagan, and global financial institutions, a deeper logic took hold. The individual became an entrepreneur of the self, no longer a citizen bound by shared duties, but a bundle of assets to be optimized. Your health is your investment. Your education is your capital. Your failure, a personal deficit. Government, under neoliberalism, is not abolished. It's redesigned. It adopts the language of business efficiency, metrics, performance. Politicians become managers, citizens become customers, and democracy becomes a consumer choice. Neoliberalism doesn't silence politics. It drains it of meaning. It tells us that politics should be guided by economics, that value is what can be priced, that problems are technical, not moral, that inequality is not injustice, it's incentive. But the consequences run deep. Public space shrinks. Solidarity dissolves. Risk is individualized, and freedom, once a cry of collective dignity, becomes the lonely burden of self-responsibility. Critics like Wendy Brown and David Harvey argue that neoliberalism is not just economic, it's existential. It reshapes subjectivity. It colonizes the soul. Even protest becomes a brand. Even resistance is monetized. And yet the ideology remains elusive. It rarely declares itself. It speaks in numbers, policies, best practices. It hides behind technocracy and pragmatism. Neoliberalism forces us to ask, what kind of freedom sells your future back to you? Can democracy survive when market logic governs every decision? And who are we if every part of life is a transaction? As neoliberalism recasts society in the image of the market, the next political vision strips away even ideology, offering management in place of vision, algorithms in place of values. Enter technocracy and the politics after politics. Latour's technocracy and post-politics, government by spreadsheet. Imagine a politics without passion. No speeches, no ideologies, no grand visions, just data, spreadsheets, and systems designed to keep things running. The train is on time. The budget is balanced. But no one remembers where the train was going. This is the world Bruno Latour warns us about, a world of post-politics, where problems are treated as technical, not existential, where politics is reduced to management and democratic life is quietly replaced by administration. Latour, a French philosopher and sociologist of science, argued that modern political systems increasingly defer to experts, not to debate ideas, but to solve them. Climate change? Trust the scientists. Economic inequality? Leave it to the economists. The role of the citizen becomes passive. The messy work of argument is outsourced to the supposedly neutral realm of expertise. This is technocracy, ruled by those who know. And in many ways, it sounds reasonable. Who wouldn't want decisions based on evidence? Who wouldn't prefer competence over chaos? But Latour's critique runs deeper. He believed that science and politics cannot be cleanly separated. Facts do not float in a vacuum. They are built through networks of instruments, institutions, and interests. Even climate models, he argued, are not just objective tools. They are entangled with political choices, funding decisions, cultural values. Post-politics, then, is not the absence of politics. It's the denial of it. It pretends that disagreement is irrational, that complexity can be solved with better software, that justice is a math problem. Latour feared that in the face of global crises, especially ecological ones, technocratic politics would fail to inspire, fail to mobilize, fail to imagine. It would measure carbon, calculate risk, and produce reports while the planet burned and people tuned out. In this world, politics becomes a simulation. Citizens become spectators, and conflict, which once drove change, is recoded as dysfunction. He forces us to ask, what is lost when politics becomes problem-solving? Can we delegate democracy to machines and managers? And without conflict, can there ever be transformation? Latour didn't call for rejecting science. He called for reclaiming politics, for building new publics around shared stakes, for embracing the controversy that drives real change. Because when politics disappears, something always fills the vacuum. And often what rises next is not reason, but rage. That brings us to the next thinker, Ernesto Laclau, who explored how authoritarian populism emerges from the ruins of consensus, speaking not to reasoned deliberation, but to the hunger for identity, rupture, and belonging. Laclau's authoritarian populism. The people as a rhetorical invention. The people rise. Flags wave. A single voice speaks on their behalf. It claims to be their truth, their pain, their anger made flesh. But who are the people, and who decides? Ernesto Laclau, an Argentinian political theorist, made a career out of this question. For him, populism wasn't a distortion of democracy, it was its core dynamic. He argued that all political identities are constructed. They do not pre-exist politics. They are born from it. Populism, Laclau said, begins with antagonism, a sense that something is wrong, that power is distant, that we are being ignored or betrayed. This we is not a fixed group. It's an empty vessel waiting to be filled. Workers, patriots, forgotten citizens, the honest many. It forms an opposition to a they, corrupt elites, outsiders, technocrats, globalists. In this antagonism, the figure of the leader emerges, not as a dictator, but as a symbolic unifier, a way to articulate a fragmented set of demands under a single banner. The leader doesn't just speak for the people, they become the people, narratively, emotionally, symbolically. Laclau wasn't defending authoritarianism, but he explained how authoritarian populism can take shape when the leader's claim to represent the people becomes unquestionable, when institutions are dismissed as obstacles, when disagreement is framed as betrayal, and when complexity is sacrificed for unity. Populism in this form is not about policy, it's about identity. It offers belonging. It makes the world legible again, us versus them, inside versus outside, pure versus corrupt. In moments of crisis, this clarity can be intoxicating. When politics becomes too abstract, when technocrats rule through algorithms, when citizens feel abandoned, populism returns with a roar. Laclau believed this was inevitable. Politics is not about solving problems, it's about constructing meaning. And meaning requires symbols, antagonisms, ruptures. To demand a politics without passion is to misunderstand what politics is. He forces us to ask, who gets to define the people? Can unity exist without erasing difference? And is every democracy always haunted by the possibility of its own undoing? As Laclau shows how identity is formed through rupture, the next idea we explore throws caution to the wind. What if the only way out of our current system is not to resist it, but to push it further, to let the machinery speed up until it burns itself out? This is the unsettling promise of accelerationism. Accelerationism. When the only way out is through the collapse. The engine is broken, but instead of hitting the brakes, someone presses the gas. The machine roars louder. Systems convulse. Markets spiral. Technology mutates faster than ethics can follow. And behind the noise, a question. What if this is the only way through? Accelerationism is not a single ideology. It's a provocation, a fractured, controversial, and often misunderstood idea that argues to overcome capitalism or modernity or the system, we may need to intensify it, not resist it. Its roots trace back to strange corners of Marxism. Some early thinkers noticed that capitalism by its very nature undermines itself. It expands markets, destabilizes tradition, revolutionizes everything it touches. Perhaps they thought, the faster it moves, the sooner it will collapse. In the 1990s, this logic returned in more radical form through theorists like Nick Land. Land's version, right accelerationism, rejected humanism entirely. He embraced the cold logic of markets, algorithms, and technological evolution. For him, trying to control or slow down the system was nostalgic, weak. Let it run. Let it escape. Let it become something post-human. On the other side, thinkers like Alex Williams and Nick Cernicek tried to reclaim accelerationism for the left. They called for harnessing technological progress toward egalitarian ends. Automate labor, reduce the workweek, use platforms for redistribution. Don't retreat, advance. But both camps agree on one thing. Deceleration is not enough. Reform is too slow. Crisis is already here, and the system is not a stable ground. It's a storm. Accelerationism asks us to look at the world not as a series of failures, but as an unfolding event, a runaway process, a feedback loop of finance, code, and fractured subjectivity. Its critics are many. Some see in it a reckless fetish for speed, for chaos. Others accuse it of ignoring the human cost of collapse, the lives ground down as the machine races on. Still others argue that accelerationism offers no real agency, just a voyeuristic ride into apocalypse. But its defenders say something different. They argue that realism demands a confrontation with momentum, that nostalgia won't save us, that critique alone is impotent without a vision of escape velocity. Accelerationism forces us to ask, is collapse inevitable or already underway? Can we shape the future without first breaking the present? And if the brakes are gone, is there anything left to steer? In a world spiraling faster each day, from climate change to AI, from financial shocks to ideological fragmentation, accelerationism doesn't offer comfort. It offers a mirror. It asks not what we can preserve, but what we are becoming. And so we arrive at the end of this long and winding journey through ideas that shaped empires, challenged systems, and unsettled the very foundations of politics. If even one of these philosophies made you pause, reflect, or see the world a little differently, then this time together has done its work. If you'd like to keep exploring ideas like these, dark, strange, profound, consider subscribing to the channel, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. Your perspective matters here, and your voice helps shape what comes next. Thank you for listening. Truly, Until next time, stay curious.